This is Russia, the biggest country in the world by landmass. But Russia's economy isn't as distributed as its surface area. The majority of its GDP is concentrated within this circle, in its western region. This has always been a big issue for every Russian leader, and now it's a big headache for Putin, as his invasion of Ukraine has accelerated what some predict to be another disintegration of the Russian state. In fact, just last month, there was news of Russian separatists rising and taking over the town of Belgorod at the Russian-Ukrainian border. Does this signal the beginning of the end? Things may seem stable now in Russia, but remember, things were stable in the 1980s before the Soviet Union collapsed. Things were stable in the 1910s before the Russian empires collapsed then. So even though things look stable now, we can't rule out a collapse, because similarities have started to appear to those who know Russian history. So, what would a Russian collapse in the 21st century look like? How would global and regional powers like the US and China take advantage of the situation to further cement their place? Let's get into all that in this video. And be sure to hit the like button. Support on recent videos have really meant a lot, and I truly mean it when I say my channel would be nowhere if it wasn't for the support and likes. So thank you so much, guys. Many have pointed out that Putin is making the same mistakes that many Russian leaders before him have made. And this may lead Russia down a similar path of disintegration like it did before. You see, the roots of Russia can be traced back to a small empire of Moscow. Of course, Russia's history, much like any other country's history, is long, but don't worry, I'll keep it quick. It is important to understand its history because, as the quote earlier points out, national interest is predetermined by history, at least in this case. Back in the days, Moscow was a peaceful place, but it became not so peaceful when the Mongols invaded in the 1200s, then ruled over it, extracting value out of its natural resources and people. This became a great lesson for Russians as they learned Moscow, or the core of Russia, is hard to protect, since there is no natural protections like an ocean or mountains. So when Ivan the Great freed Russia from the Mongols in the late 1400s, he set out to expand Russia and create a buffer zone between Moscow and Moscow's enemies. After Ivan the Great's death, Ivan the Terrible became the Tsar of Russia. Unlike his name implies, he actually continued Russian expansion far into the east, bringing Siberia under Moscow's control. Side note, he got the nickname Ivan the Terrible because of his reign of terror against the Russian nobility. After he died in 1584, Moscow goes into civil war, it's invaded by Poland, but Polish rule only lasts a couple of years, then Moscow goes back into chaos, and that chaos continues until Mikhail Romanov takes over Russia in 1613. From there on, the Romanov dynasty continues ruling over Russia for 3 centuries and continues expanding Russian borders here and there. In fact, during the dynasty, Russia expanded all the way up to Alaska, and until 1865, Alaska was actually a Russian territory. In 1865, Russia sold Alaska and the Aleutian Islands to the United States. Now, we did speed through a lot of history here because mainly it didn't relate to the story, but here's what's really important. This is Russia's map in 1914. They have expanded a lot, from a small city of Moscow when the Mongols invaded, to this. Now it's a full-on empire. In fact, it's the biggest empire in the world, all in an effort to create a buffer between Moscow and Moscow's enemies. Then, in 1914, Russia decided to enter World War I. This would be the last war Russia would fight under the Tsar. You see, before this, Russia had fought multiple wars and lost multiple wars, like the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War. Each loss came at a hefty cost. Wartime created frequent food shortages across the Russian Empire, and the country suffered heavy losses of soldiers, ships, money, and international prestige. So, as you can tell, even before entering World War I, Russia was at a delicate stage. In fact, in 1905, there were large protests by Russian workers against the monarchy, where hundreds of unarmed protesters were killed by Tsar troops. This massacre sparked the Russian Revolution in 1905, during which angry workers responded with a series of crippling strikes throughout the country. To calm all this down, Nicholas II promised greater freedom of speech and the formation of a representative assembly, or Duma, to work towards a reform. He also promised that he would give out a special thank you note to everyone who subscribes to Business Basics, so be sure to hit that sub button below. Okay, actually, I'm the one promising that. Alright, jokes aside. Clearly, Russia wasn't in a position to fight a war, economically or militarily. Entering World War I only made things worse for Russians at home. Russian casualties were greater than those sustained by any other nation in any previous war. Food and fuel shortages plagued Russia as inflation mounted. The already weak economy was hopelessly disrupted by the costly war effort. Government corruption was rampant. The Russian economy remained backwards, and Nicholas repeatedly dissolved the Duma when it opposed his will. In 1917, revolution broke out in Petrograd, today St. Petersburg, where protesters clashed with police and refused to give up. Protests got so big that it gave the Duma the opportunity to form a provisional government and remove the Tsar from the throne. The new government continued the Russian war efforts in World War I, even though Russia's food supply problems continued to persist. This exacerbated the unrest in the country. Then, later that year, another party called the Bolshevik Party, led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, maybe you've heard of him, saw the opportunity and overthrew the Duma's provisional government. This was the official rise of the Russian Communist Party, which was born after the first fall of the Russian Empire. After centuries of expansion, Russia got too big for a central leader to control. But Russian thirst for expansion didn't stop, and that's what led to this eventual downfall. Remember this, as this will be a common theme in modern Russian history, and quite likely to be the theme of current Russia. During all of this havoc, Russia lost a considerable amount of territory. One of the most significant losses was the territory of Poland, which had been partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary in the late 18th century. In 1918, Poland declared independence and fought a war against Soviet Russia to secure its borders. The war ended with the Treaty of Riga in 1921, which recognized Polish independence and gave Poland control of significant territories that had previously been part of the Russian Empire. In addition to Poland, the Soviet Union also lost control of Finland, which declared independence in 1917, and fought a brief war against Soviet Russia in 1918. The resulting Treaty of Tartu in 1920 recognized Finland's independence and established the new border between Finland and Soviet Russia. Similarly, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also declared independence in 1918 and fought wars against Soviet Russia to secure their independence. The resulting treaties recognized their independence and established new borders between them and the Soviet Union. Finally, after the end of World War I, Romania gained significant territories from Russia as a result of the Treaty of Bucharest in 1918. These territories included parts of Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transylvania. Overall, the loss of these territories was a significant blow to the Soviet Union, which had hoped to maintain control over its former imperial territories. After everything was settled, Russia lost about 30% of its territory. Overall, the loss of these territories was a significant blow to Russia's prestige and power, which eventually led to new leaders taking control at the helm. The loss of territory had several economic consequences for Russia. The territories that Russia lost were rich in natural resources like timber, minerals, and agricultural land, which were important sources of income and exports. Losing access to these resources had a significant impact on the Russian economy, which was already struggling after World War I and the Russian Revolution. The loss of these territories also had an impact on Russia's economic and trade relations with other countries. The newly independent states that emerged from the territories that Russia lost often pursued their own trade policies, which were different than Russia's. This affected Russia's access to markets and goods, as well as its ability to negotiate trade agreements. In addition, the loss of these territories weakened Russia's ability to project power and influence in the region. This made Russia more vulnerable to external threats and challenges, which affected its economic stability and growth. The loss of these territories also had a profound impact on the Russian national identity and psyche, which had been tied to the idea of a powerful and expansive empire. The loss of these territories challenged this identity and contributed to a sense of loss and disillusionment among many Russians. Overall, the loss of territory had a significant impact on the Russian economy and society, which was felt for many years. This economic hardship helped Stalin consolidate power, who came into a leadership position in the late 1920s. After taking control, he implemented a series of policies that aimed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet economy, at any cost. This meant forced collectivization of agriculture and the development of heavy industry. This policy was aimed at transforming the Soviet Union from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse, and it led to significant economic growth and modernization. However, the policies of forced collectivization and industrialization also had significant human costs. Millions of people were forcibly relocated to collective farms, and many died in famines and other disasters that were caused by the disruption of traditional agricultural practices. The development of heavy industry was also accompanied by poor working conditions and a lack of regard for worker safety, which led to many accidents and deaths. The Stalinist regime was also characterized by brutal repression of political opposition. Stalin's regime was responsible for the execution of hundreds of thousands of people, and millions more were sent to labor camps or imprisoned in the infamous Gulag system. The Soviet secret police, also known as the NKVD, carried out mass purges of political opponents, intellectuals, and other perceived enemies of the state. The regime also implemented strict censorship and propaganda measures to control the flow of information and maintain its grip on power. Once the economy was growing and dissent at home was under control, Stalin focused on expanding the Soviet Empire once again. Now, this is a mistake I made in a previous video that many of you pointed out. I called the Soviets the good guys in World War II, when in fact this really wasn't the case. Soviets were in fact the aggressors in World War II, just like the Germans. In 1939, Soviets signed a secret pact with Germans, agreeing to not go against the Nazis when they invaded Poland. The agreement also included a protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin used this pact as an opportunity to go on a conquest of his own. Soon after signing the agreement, the Soviet Union annexed the eastern part of Poland in September of 1939, shortly after Nazi Germany invaded from the west. The Soviet Union also annexed parts of Romania in 1940, following a Soviet ultimatum to the Romanian government. During the Winter War in Finland in 1939 and 1940, the Soviet Union annexed parts of Finnish territory, including the Karelian Isthmus. However, the Soviet Union was unable to achieve its objective of conquering Finland, and the annexation of Finnish territory was widely condemned by the international community. While all of this was happening, Hitler had taken over a big part of Western Europe, and as the war was progressing, he started to see the Soviet Union as a potential target for expansion. So, on June 22, 1941, Germany launched a surprise attack known as Operation Barbarossa against Soviets, which forced Stalin to join the Allies and fight against Germany. After this, the Soviet Union played a key role in defeating Nazi Germany and their allies, and its military forces occupied large portions of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union established communist governments in many of these occupied countries, which were seen as satellite states of the Soviet Union. These governments were often installed through rigged elections or through the use of force, and they were characterized by political repression, censorship, and the suppression of dissent. The Soviet Union annexed several territories that had been part of Nazi Germany or its allies, including parts of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Prussia. The annexation of these territories contributed to the division of Europe into two opposing blocs, the Western democracies and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. Now, this new Soviet Union was no different than the history of Russia. If you remember the start of our story, Moscow started as a city and expanded into a union of many different states and regions. Much like the Soviet Union, Russia has always been a union of regions and people that come from different cultures, speak different languages, and share unique beliefs. Now, this makes Russian culture very diverse, but it also makes it very susceptible to a breakaway state when things are not going well. We'll get back to this in just a minute. After World War II, the world went into the Cold War. In a speech, Winston Churchill declared an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, and the Cold War grows as the Soviets promote revolution in China, Asia, and Middle East. In 1949, the Soviets exploded a nuclear bomb, hastening the nuclear arms race. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union pursued a socialist economic system that emphasized state ownership of the means of production and central planning. The Soviet economy was heavily focused on heavy industry and military spending. with a large portion of resources devoted to the production of weapons and other military equipment. While the Soviet economy grew rapidly in the years immediately following World War II, that all slowed down as productivity slowed down. This was due in part to a lack of investment in new technology and equipment, and the central planning system, which made it difficult to innovate and improve production methods. Much like today's Russia, the Soviet economy was heavily dependent on exports of oil, gas, and other natural resources to earn foreign currency. However, fluctuations in global commodity prices and changes in international demand made it difficult to maintain a stable source of income. The economy was also never able to become diversified because it wasn't a free market. It was centralized decision-making, aka a modified version of a communist system. In this system, the government would set targets for production and allocated resources. This made it a very inefficient economy when it came to serving its citizens. Here's a simplified explanation on why this didn't work. The government would tell workers what they needed to work on. So you would get orders to make a bunch of cereal for the country, but many factories are getting the same orders. That means you aren't producing a lot of bread. But now let's say public taste changes and they want bread instead of cereal. You as a factory owner aren't able to just switch your resources to producing bread because you are required to follow orders from the government. Now, governments are always slow to adapt, so demand for cereal isn't what it used to be and supply is the same. So you have an overproduction of cereal and a shortage of bread. I realize this is a very stupid example, but hopefully you guys get my point. Now imagine this happening across the whole economy. You can see why this is a problem. And a quick reminder to hit that like button if you haven't already. I apologize for the interruption. Okay, let's get back to the video. On top of all this, the Soviet Union also faced economic sanctions and embargoes from the West, which further strained the economy. One of the most visible effects of the Soviet Union's economic challenges was the shortage of basic goods, such as food, clothing, and household items. Queues for basic goods were common, and many people had to rely on the black market to obtain essential items. The economic challenges also led to a decline in the quality of life for many of its citizens. Housing conditions were often cramped and inadequate, and public services such as healthcare and education suffered from underfunding and neglect. Despite the Soviet Union's emphasis on equality, many workers had low wages and limited opportunities for advancement. The lack of incentives for workers and managers to increase efficiency or reduce waste also contributed to low productivity and poor working conditions. Then, in the 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced a series of economic reforms, known as perestroika, in an attempt to modernize the Soviet economy. Perestroika was intended to modernize and restructure the Soviet economy in order to improve productivity, promote innovation, and encourage greater efficiency. The reforms were broad and encompassed many different areas of the Soviet economy, including agriculture, industry, and foreign trade. One of the key aspects of perestroika was the decentralization of economic decision-making. Under the previous system of central planning, enterprises had little autonomy in deciding what to produce and how to allocate resources. Perestroika aimed to give enterprises greater flexibility in those areas, in order to encourage innovation and improve efficiency. Another important aspect of perestroika was the promotion of market-oriented reforms. This included the introduction of limited private enterprise, the development of a stock market, and greater opportunities for foreign investment. The hope was that these reforms would encourage innovation and promote greater efficiency in the Soviet economy. Perestroika also aimed to promote greater openness and transparency in government and economic affairs. This included the relaxation of censorship and the encouragement of public debate on economic and political issues. Despite these goals, the implementation of perestroika was uneven and often met with resistance from conservative elements within the Communist Party and the Soviet bureaucracy. The reforms were also hampered by a lack of clear direction and a failure to address fundamental problems within the Soviet economy. While the economy and citizens at home struggled, Russia entered another war in Afghanistan, which many see as a common trend before the fall of a Russian empire. On Christmas Eve, 1979, the Soviet Union began an invasion of Afghanistan to support the communist government there because it didn't want the region to fall to NATO's hands as it considered it to be an important geopolitical location. The Afghan War quickly settled down into a stalemate, with more than 100,000 Soviet troops controlling the cities, larger towns, and major garrisons, and the Mujahideen moving with relative freedom through the countryside. This forced the Soviets to dedicate more resources to the war instead of focusing on improving the domestic economy. The war became a quagmire for what, by the late 1980s, was a disintegrating Soviet Union. By then, the Soviets had suffered tens of thousands of losses. The war wreaked havoc, not only on Afghanistan, but on the Soviet Union, whose economy and national prestige took a severe drubbing. Back at home, perestroika failed to modernize the Soviet economy and address the deep-seated problems that had been developing over decades of central planning and bureaucratic inefficiencies. Decades of economic challenges had exacerbated the economic inequality. Many workers had low wages and limited opportunities for advancement, while officials and party members often enjoyed special privileges and access to scarce goods. The Soviet Union's economic challenges contributed to widespread skepticism of the government's ability to manage the economy and provide for its citizens. This, in turn, contributed to a broader sense of disillusionment with the Soviet system and the government's ability to deliver on its promise. By now, the USSR had become one of the biggest nations in the world, occupying nearly 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, and was made up of 15 republics: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. But cracks were now beginning to show. The divide between the extreme wealth of the elites and the poverty of Soviet citizens created a backlash for younger people who refused to adopt Communist Party ideology as their parents had. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's reforms were slow to bear fruit and did more to hasten the collapse of the Soviet Union rather than help it. A loosening of controls over the Soviet people emboldened independence movements in the satellite states of Eastern Europe. Political revolutions in Poland in 1989 sparked other, mostly peaceful revolutions across Eastern European states and led to the toppling of the Berlin Wall. An unsuccessful coup by Communist Party hardliners in August 1991 sealed the Soviet Union's fate by diminishing Gorbachev's power and propelling democratic forces, led by Boris Yeltsin, to the forefront of Russian politics. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned as the leader of the USSR. The Soviet Union ceased to exist on December 31st, 1991. All 15 republics we talked about earlier became independent states. The Soviets also lost control of territories it controlled in Finland, Poland, and Romania. Collapse also led to a sharp decline in industrial output and a rise in unemployment. In 1991 alone, the GDP dropped by about 1/6, and the budget deficit was approximately 1/4 of GDP. Hyperinflation ran rampant because of this and led to the collapse of local currency in newly formed Russia. Just to put into perspective how bad this economic downturn was for Russia, it is widely believed to be worse than the 1930s Great Depression that was experienced in the United States. While all this was happening, Chechnya tried to gain independence from Russia, where Putin used brutal tactics to kill the revolution. I have a detailed video about this on the second channel if you guys are interested in the full story. After one of the fastest privatization efforts, which gave rise to loads of oligarchs, Russia was on its way to become a democracy and a market economy. Then, Putin came into power in the late 1990s as prime minister. Later, he won his bid to the presidency in the early 2000s, and everything changed. Just to get an idea of what Putin's goal is, here's a little sneak peek into his mind. Putin described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Based on his actions since he came into power, we can see that Putin is on a mission to reassemble the Soviet Union. He has consolidated power in the Russian parliament, used a puppet as a president to keep control while he was away from office, and since then has abolished any term limits for Russian presidents, aka himself. Political dissent is punished by poison and being thrown in jail, as we saw with Navalny. Putin has also used military forces to directly aid regions from past Soviet states to fight against their military. Like in 2008, when Russian forces entered Georgian territory to gain control of the separatist Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Russia has since maintained its military presence in both regions. Then again in 2014, when Putin famously annexed Crimea from Ukraine. Putin tried building on this move by launching a full-scale invasion in 2022. But it seems like this may be the last straw that breaks Russia's union. Much like the Soviet Union, Russia today is a federal state, with 83 republics and regions that are colonized by the Kremlin. It's the biggest nation by landmass, spanning across 11 time zones. 20% of its population is not ethnically Russian, but instead belong to local indigenous nations. Once again, following its thirst for expansion, Moscow is in a war where it's bleeding men and resources, all while its domestic economy is struggling. Worse yet, this has become a war of ammunition, where Moscow is fighting to keep up with supplies from the whole West. In a war where Russia is expected to outlast NATO's pockets, all while being cut off from global trade as the most sanctioned nation on Earth. This seems like a recipe for disaster. With casualties continuing to pile up and no end in sight for President Vladimir Putin's messianic revanchism, the eventual dissolution of the Russian Federation can no longer be dismissed out of hand. Ever since Putin targeted specific nationalities such as Sakha, Tatars, and Chechens for conscription, the cry for autonomy has picked up. Of course, this desire to be free is nothing new, especially among Russia's minority regions. Previously, the Kremlin was always able to snuff out extremists who could pose a problem, but this time the desire may be different. Kremlin resources are running thin, and Western governments are more willing than ever to fight Russia against its brutality. Russia has a long history of leaders employing a mix of carrots and sticks to keep the country's far-flung regions united. Tsars granted cultural autonomy to some conquered nations, while they violently forced assimilation on others. The Soviet regime followed that same playbook, sometimes celebrating national identities, sometimes deporting and punishing peoples deemed unfaithful to the Soviet project. Under Putin's rule, growing socioeconomic disparities between residents in rich metropolitan centers and those in poorer provincial regions have generated tensions. The war in Ukraine could increase calls for greater autonomy from Moscow. The military mobilization in September has generated a backlash in areas with large populations of ethnic minorities, whose conscriptions have already suffered high casualty rates. Even though few may want Russia's dissolution today, it's not difficult to imagine a scenario where growing political, economic, and social instability will, at some point, compel Russia's constituent units to seek safety and independence. If Russia somehow withdraws from a war in a manner that hurts its prestige, it could set off a chain reaction much like it did in 1989 when it withdrew from Afghanistan. This will evoke opposition to Putin's policies and propel a revolution to replace him. That's why the Kremlin is fearful of even the slightest public unrest. Public protests can quickly spiral into a major event, especially during an economic downturn caused by Putin's war. If protests become too big, local politicians will quickly realize that supporting Putin may not be in their best interest. This will present a big problem for Putin, as in remote regions, local leaders have much more favorable public support than Putin does. If a situation like this happens, the Kremlin may try to steer the population towards ethnic scapegoating by depicting a potential separatist republic as an existential threat to Russia, similar to what it did in Chechnya in the 1990s. Even with all these possibilities, Putin's biggest threat lies right now next to him in Moscow. Russia's political stability revolves around the elites supporting Putin. During times of uncertainty, power struggles could erupt between rival elites and oligarchs. These conflicts can burst into the open, adding fuel to the unrest around the country. As of the writing of the script, the Wagner Group leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, posted a poll in his Telegram channel asking his supporters if they would vote for him as president against Putin. As this shows, elitist loyalty towards Putin is not based on ideology, but on economic and political benefits. If elites feel that Putin can't deliver that anymore, they will be quick to turn on him. The failed war with Ukraine, which has revealed the weakness of Putin and his state, could very well be the spark that ignites the frayed timbers of Russian institutions. Of course, sparks are unpredictable. and Russia could weather the current crisis and survive in its present form, whether under Putin or a successor. But even if it does, it will be severely weakened as a state, and all the structural tensions will remain. Putin may even suspect this. In his 2023 New Year's address, he invoked the war's potential threat to Russian independence, something he has not said before. If Russia were to collapse, the biggest issue to arise would be how its nuclear arsenal is handled. This will be a huge point for all countries, including those in the EU, the USA, and China, because no one wants Russia's nuclear weapons to fall into dangerous hands. Considering this point, it's fair to say that no country really wants Russia to collapse, but it's easy to forget that the USA and the West had very little to do with the USSR's collapse. Bigger structural forces were the reason behind the USSR's collapse, and they could be the reason behind Russia's future collapse. No one knows what will happen to the nuclear arsenal, but everyone will try to make sure it doesn't lead to a world-ending event. But there are definitely other points where superpowers will disagree. China is heavily dependent on imported energy to fuel its rapid economic growth, and Russia has become an increasingly important supplier of oil and natural gas to China in these recent years. In 2020, Russia was China's largest supplier of crude oil, accounting for around 15% of China's total crude oil imports, and also supplied around 12% of China's natural gas imports. If Russia were to collapse, it could disrupt the flow of oil and natural gas to China, potentially leading to shortages and higher prices. This could have significant economic implications for China, as well as for global energy markets. China would seek to increase its influence in the region and fill the power vacuum left by Russia's collapse. China has been expanding its economic and political influence in Central Asia and other neighboring regions, and a collapse of Russia could create opportunities for China to bolster its position in the region. China may also be concerned about the potential for instability and conflict in the region following the collapse of Russia. China is already facing challenges in its western Xinjiang region, where there have been separatist movements and ethnic tensions, and a collapse of Russia could exacerbate these issues. Additionally, China may be concerned about the potential for a flood of refugees or an increase in transnational crime and terrorism in the region. China would also be very wary of the USA's actions in the region following a collapse, and would probably look to counter them. The United States would likely react to a collapse of Russia in a number of different ways, depending on the specific circumstances surrounding such an event. One possible scenario is that the United States would seek to increase its influence in the region and fill the power vacuum left by Russia's collapse. The United States has long been interested in promoting democracy and human rights in Russia, and a collapse of the Russian government could provide an opportunity for the United States to push for greater political and economic reforms in the country. On the other hand, the United States may also be concerned about the potential for instability and conflict in the region following a collapse of Russia. A power vacuum in Russia could lead to increased competition among other countries, such as China and European powers, for influence in the region. This could potentially lead to increased tensions and conflict, which could threaten the U.S. interests in the region. European countries have significant economic ties with Russia, particularly in the areas of energy and trade. A collapse of Russia could disrupt the economic ties and potentially lead to economic losses for European countries. Additionally, European countries may be concerned about the potential for instability and conflict in the region, particularly if there were a breakdown in law and order or a mass exodus of refugees. I'm sure every country is following the war closely, and if 1989 was any lesson, many superpowers are preparing their response to all possible scenarios. This took an insane amount of effort, so please be sure to hit the like button. It helps me out a lot. Thank you. If you're someone who's missing out on the latest news on this war and, in fact, any geopolitics, then I would have to say that that's on you. Because I recently launched Global Recaps, a geopolitics newsletter that I send directly to your inbox, covering the most important world news of the day. It's simple, takes only 5 minutes to read, and best of all, it's completely free. So sign up now using the link in the description and never miss out on any news. This is Russia, and these are Russia's neighbors. The nation is currently locked in several disputes over land and territory, and it's waging war over its borders. Yes, I'm being literal. Russia is literally going to war over its borders and territories in the pursuit of what it feels belongs to them.
Russia has demanded that NATO should stop expanding eastwards.
U.S. soldiers to
Russia's land border,
training with live fires in NATO ally Estonia.
Threatening Russian security.
Canada is to defend Latvia from any aggression by Russia.
Japan's territorial dispute
Over the islands goes back to Russia claiming ownership.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin
Suggested the two nations sign a peace treaty.
Norway next shares land and maritime borders with Russia.
Troops have surrounded Ukraine.
People wanting to cross the border between Poland and Belarus.
For so long, Russia has warned about its borders and territory being encroached on. But no one really thought Russia would wage war, well, at least until they did. Now Russia is in a massive war. Oh, sorry, it's a military operation with Ukraine. And regardless of who you think is winning it, there are massive casualties on both sides. Ukraine might be their current and biggest focus, but it's not the only land that Putin may be willing to spill blood for. Today, I'll explore the Russian border crisis and the nations entangled with Russia in it. Again, the Russian-Ukraine border problem may be the most publicized, but it's not the only one. And if we're going to predict or prepare for the future, we must go into the past and learn. Who knows, your country might be involved in one of these disputes with Mother Russia. The US, Canada, and even Finland have a border crisis with Russia, as you will soon see. Could that mean an impending war too? Please take a moment to like this video. Any videos that dive into military conflicts and the like tend to get the shorter end of the stick with the YouTube algorithm. Every like helps me correct this, well, according to me, injustice. Back to business basics. See what I did there? Anyway, this is what the Soviet Union looked like at the height of its power. Many of Russia's territorial disputes came from the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. When the Soviet Union fell, several states emerged, with Russia being the major parent state. With the emergence of these new states, so too did the issues of border lines, demarcations, and lineage stresses start. This is primarily where the Ukraine issue comes into play. I will cover this in depth later in the video, but to start with, let me talk about a major but lesser-known dispute between Russia and another superpower, Japan. It's always with the biggest rivals that the fiercest conflicts emerge. These are the beautiful, yet heavily debated, Kuril Islands, a fierce battleground of Russia and Japanese aggression. When the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, with Russian troops causing havoc in Ukraine, the Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi revived Tokyo's claims on the southern Kurils, the disputed area, describing the region, which it refers to as its northern territories, as an integral part of the Pacific state. With the havoc that Russia was raining on Ukraine, it only made sense that other nations with whom Russia has border issues were especially sensitized to the matter. Do you know who didn't get that memo? Russia. Instead of inspiring confidence, Russia withdrew from all peace talks on the matter. To add insult to injury, Russia began to conduct military drills in the disputed region in what was meant to be a show of force against both Japan and the Western Bloc. Talk about diplomatic failures. Well, the question is, what exactly is the dispute that Japan is so sensitive about and Russia is so controlling over? You see, the territorial dispute between the two is over the de facto maritime boundaries that separates the territorial waters of the two countries. And those waters are the Kuril Islands. These are an island chain located between Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula and Japan, a country that on its own is a collection of islands. I'm not kidding, it really is a collection. In its peninsula, Japan is comprised of over 6,800 islands. This Kuril island chain, which both Russia and Japan claim, is the main source of the contention, and it has been since at least the mid-19th century. Dating back to the 19th century, even to the present day, the Kuril Islands chain, or at least certain parts of it, have at different points changed hands between Russian and Japanese control. The territorial crisis is unique in that it comes in two forms. The first one is, who even owns these islands between the two powers? The second question, the one that has been in discussion recently, is what islands constitute the Kuril Islands in the first place? Let me give you the rundown on both, starting with who owns these islands. From 1855, when the two Pacific nations established their first official ties, to 1875, when the Treaty of St. Petersburg was signed between Japan and Russia, the Kuril Islands were divided between the two countries. This was the harmonious time when equality reigned supreme. The Treaty of Shimoda, formerly known as the Treaty of Commerce and Navigation between Japan and Russia, was signed in 1855, serving as the first treaty between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan. The actual terminology used in the Treaty of Shimoda when it came to this island's matter was that, henceforth, the borders between Russia and Japan will pass between the islands Iturup, or Eturafu, and Urup, or Urupu. The whole island of Iturup belongs to Japan, and the whole island of Urup and the other Kuril Islands in the north constitute possessions of Russia. Time passed, and with the Treaty of St. Petersburg that was signed between the two countries in 1875, Russia voluntarily handed over control of the entire Kuril Islands chain to Japan. It wasn't for free, though. They, in exchange, received full ownership over the large island of Sakhalin, which extends from north to south, adjacent to the Russian mainland in the Pacific, near the northern parts of Japan. This is where some of the problems are said to have started. Because as nations that spoke different languages, translation discrepancies between different official texts created an ambiguity over which islands should be considered part of the Kuril Islands. That was the gateway to the problems of what the Kuril Islands are, where they start and where they end. More on that in just a minute, though. As the years passed and diplomatic relations failed, Russia eventually seized all the Kuril Islands as part of its victory after the Allied powers won the Second World War in 1945. Since Japan had allied with Nazi Germany, they were part of the losers, and as such, received the shorter end of the agreements that came. Talk about being on the wrong side of history, huh? What makes the Kuril Islands dispute special, however, is that, unlike other concessions that Japan made with Russia, no agreements were signed. Formally, Japan and the then Soviet Union never signed a peace agreement to officially end their hostilities and create new alliances. Since then, Japan has attempted talks with Russia. At this point, the negotiations have come down to what islands are regarded as part of the Kuril Islands. When you look at the island chain, Russia claims sovereignty over the entirety of it, and that consists of all 18 islands. Japan, on the other hand, declares that the four southernmost islands on the chain, which are Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan, and Habomai Islands, are Japanese territory and are not part of the Kuril Islands. They argue that these named islands should not be, by any means, a part of the so-called Russian territory. Take a look at this map. It will give you some perspective. You can see how the Russian borders have encroached closer and closer to Japan with time, and you can see just how close the four islands are to Japan. Were Russia to use them as military zones, Japan would be very vulnerable, and that's their fear. And Japan is not wrong to fear the possibilities that these islands could create. The Kuril Islands offer several military and political advantages for Russia. First, due to their geographical position, they make it easier for Russia to maneuver its Pacific fleet of warships and submarines into the Pacific Ocean, a task that would otherwise be very difficult during sub-zero temperatures in winter. This gives their navy better mobility and quicker reaction times during conflicts. This is an advantage that cannot be understated. Secondly, on the chessboard of global politics, Russia remains wary that, should Japan regain sovereignty, it could use these islands as a base for its armed forces and deploy long-range missiles from them. Putin is very paranoid and has always seen himself as surrounded by enemies. Japan's close alliance with the US might mean that if returned,
Tokyo may allow US Marines based in Japan to set up a military base on the Nansei Islands, further heightening concerns for Russia. This could also lead to the Sea of Okhotsk, an area considered to be Russian jurisdiction, being forced to accommodate foreign-owned military ships. This is a complete no for Putin. He cannot harbor enemies in his backyard. So you see, friends, Russia's reason for keeping the islands is Japan's reason for not wanting them to have them. You see the irony? And this, the military exercises that Russia performed in the Pacific, do not serve to ease Japan's worried mind at all. Before Russia removed itself from the negotiating table, both nations had made statements that indicated resolution seeking. The Japanese Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, before Russia invaded Ukraine, had said, "It's extremely regrettable that 76 years after the war, the issue of the Northern Territories hasn't been resolved, and a peace treaty between Japan and Russia hasn't been agreed upon." Even Russian President Vladimir Putin also expressed his intent for resolution, saying, "We believe that the absence of a peace treaty in our relations is absurd." However, the world before the invasion of Ukraine and the world today are two very different things. Most nations just see Russia as being bloodthirsty, and it's no surprise that talks between Russian and Japanese delegations have collapsed. Peace talks that will produce a concrete political resolution may not be something that will happen in the near future, and that's something we might just have to accept. Japan, however, is not the only superpower that Russia has had border disputes with before. Let's take a look at the Russia-China dispute. By the way, as I've mentioned before, some of the topics I cover are not liked by YouTube or sponsors. That's why I don't really have many sponsors in my videos, but it's no problem. I recently launched a Patreon, where you guys can support the videos directly. These topics and videos are made possible by the support of my Patreons. So, if you enjoy the subjects I cover, and you have the money to spare, please consider supporting the videos on Patreon by clicking the link in the description. Though Russia and China are as thick as thieves, no pun intended, regarding their actions towards both Ukraine and Taiwan, the two have had fierce land disputes before. Looking back in history, Russia, perhaps more than any other country, has been China's biggest and most ferocious ally, even helping the CCP to rise to power in the very beginning. This is something I actually covered in depth in one of my more recent videos. Feel free to check out that video and get a more comprehensive understanding. The link will be in the description below. Despite the two nations being heavy allies, in the mid-1950s, Moscow and Beijing began to drift ideologically over what they perceived as the future direction of communism. China at that point favored continued aggression towards imperialist nations, while the USSR began to consider peaceful coexistence with the United States. It's actually funny to think of the Soviet Union as the mild-tempered one here. In no time, however, the ideological differences between the two nations escalated very quickly and started to result in both the Chinese and the Soviets competing for territory and control of communist satellite states. It was a battle for who would become the leader of communism in the New World. What started as a veiled competition soon lost its veil. By the 1960s, Moscow and Beijing boasted very direct and public critiques of each other in the media. This added to the collapse of the diplomatic relations between the nations, with Russia even recalling thousands of Soviet advisors from China. They even went on to cancel the economic and military aid that they had always provided to China. I mention all this so that you can have a background as to how matters have escalated. It's easy to resolve conflicts amongst allies, but conflict resolution at a time of diplomatic struggle is, well, tough, to say the least. And the latter is exactly what happened. You see, tensions between the two nations finally exploded in March of 1969 along the Ussuri River, which was the poorly demarcated border between the Soviet Union and Northeast China. There was no love lost, and what could have been solved became a blazing fire. What was the disputed land, you ask? Well, the history of the conflict came from a gross alteration of the Russian border by a border commissioner. Back in 1869, he persuaded the Chinese to accept and sign a small-scale map that he had. On the map, he had given the Russians territory that wasn't theirs. Where the previous arrangements had left the Amur and Ussuri as boundary rivers, and therefore shared international waterways, his map made them exclusively Russian by marking the international boundary along the Chinese banks. There were other alterations, but they all served the same purpose: to give Russia an advantage. As the years went on, the Russians began depicting this commissioner's version of the boundary on their maps, and over the years, authoritative European cartographers came to follow suit. From the early 1920s, the appropriated lands were occupied by Soviet citizens, thus making them Soviet territory. China, however, claimed the islands, as they were on the Chinese side of the river. China was working with what the international law adhered to, but at that point, the Soviets wanted, and had already effectively controlled, almost every island along those rivers. That is why China felt that the way to get them back was through military conflict. What was seen as just two allies arguing soon escalated into something much more. It was no laughing matter when the border harassment escalated into a shouting match on March 2nd and March 15th, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. This had officially become an armed conflict bordering on war. These military tussles continued for a while as each of the two nations began to prepare for war. When you read your history books, you will see that this is one of those moments where the world watched and feared that nuclear conflict, and perhaps a third world war, was about to break out. Repeatedly during this time, Moscow hinted at the possibility of a preemptive strike against Chinese nuclear installations, while China built up a vast underground network of tunnels and shelters to be used in case of a nuclear attack. What's interesting in this matchup, and the potential war, was that at that time in history, the Soviet Union was actually in control of all the territory that the Chinese were claiming. Moreover, militarily, Moscow was in a superior position. The Chinese happened to be in a much larger numbers, but weak militarily. However, military confrontation and buildup on Sino-Soviet borders proved to be a drain for the Soviet Union, especially so when Moscow was locked in a global political, ideological, and strategic rivalry with the West. Fortunately for the rest of the world, this armed conflict subsided and the border crisis came to an end in 1969. This was a result of Russian and Chinese delegates meeting and coming to terms. For decades after this, the two countries would keep coming back to the table, and in 2003, the border agreement between Russia and China was signed, putting a rest to the disputes. China was granted control over a handful of the islands. On the 21st of July 2008, a Chinese foreign minister and his Russian counterpart signed an additional Sino-Russian borderline agreement, marking the acceptance of the demarcation of the eastern portion of the Chinese-Russian border in Beijing. An additional protocol, with a map affiliated on the eastern part of the borders both countries share, was signed. The agreement also includes the Chinese ownership of another island and a half. This might stand as one of the few border conflicts in history to see a mutually agreed upon end. I, for one, am happier because of it. Two superpowers have no business fighting over territory unnecessarily. The world doesn't need any of that. Solving this large issue of contention, no doubt, gave Russia and China the space they needed to repair and grow their diplomatic relationships further. And now they stand as very crucial trading partners for each other. Let's move on to another border dispute that I know you're very familiar with. That is the border dispute that threatens to take the whole of Europe to war with it. That is the Ukraine and Russia border dispute. Many think that Russia's aggression towards Ukraine is something that started last year when Russia invaded Ukraine. No, it's something that started in 1991, the very day that the Soviet Union fell. As Russia emerged as the successor state to the Soviet Union, the largest of all the countries that were born, Ukraine was the second largest. Putin never really got over how many resources, infrastructure, and people Ukraine got away with after the Soviet collapse. That was the birth of this feud. With Ukraine, it's much more than a border crisis. Yes, Putin wants land from Ukraine, but he also wants resources, and he wants people. This is something I talked about in my Russian population video. Take a look at it on the channel, you will find it interesting. This Russian aggression and, well, greed, is what led Putin to the Crimea incident in 2014, the first major highlight of the border crisis between the two nations.
President Vladimir Putin casts his shadow across the invasion of Ukraine known as Crimea.
Russian troops spreading out to take control of military bases in strategic Crimean peninsula.
Russia's decision to send troops into Crimea, rightly drawn global condemnation.
The Russian military must stand down.
The Russian forces are consolidating their grip with the support of a largely friendly local population,
where voters decided to rejoin Russia.
In law, the Crimea is Ukrainian, but in the hearts of many.
With the stroke of a pen, Russia defied protesters in Kiev, minorities in Crimea, and leaders across the Western world.
A treaty formalizing the annexation of
Crimea.
Western countries condemned the move and imposed economic sanctions against Moscow.
And will not be recognized by the international community.
In 2014, in Crimea, a region of Ukraine, it was claimed that dissension started to arise as pro-Russian protesters started calling for the region of Crimea to return to Russia, as they wanted to return to their roots. Most publications called this a farce, and they stated that a good number of these masked, violent protesters were all Putin's puppets. The claim is that Putin was arming and funding them to cause havoc in the resource-rich area of Crimea. As Ukraine began to attempt to act on the dissension, Russian authorities sent armed troops into the region to protect the Russians there. This was frowned upon as a provocation and a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, but oh well, you know Putin. He really doesn't give a care in the world. With pressure mounting and Russian interference at an all-time high, on March 6th, the Crimean parliament voted to secede from Ukraine and join the Russian Federation, with a public referendum on the matter scheduled for March 16, 2014. The move was hailed by Russia and broadly condemned in the West. Think about it. A province of your country, crucial to the nation, just wakes up and says, oh, well, we're leaving. That had to hurt. On the day of the referendum, observers noted numerous irregularities in the voting process, including the presence of armed men at polling stations. It was clear what was going on, and yet little really could be done to stop them. It was no surprise to anyone when the results were announced, and it was an overwhelming 97% vote in favor of joining Russia. The Ukrainian government, of course, rejected this notion, but Putin had everything he needed to take this from a border crisis to a complete annexation. Though Russia was hit with several sanctions by the US and the EU, they didn't shake. Sanctions don't really seem to have the desired effect on Russia, as recent history has shown. Once the referendum was done, Russia did not waste any time. Russian troops moved to occupy bases throughout the peninsula, including the Ukrainian naval headquarters in Sevastopol, as Ukraine initiated the evacuation of some 25,000 military personnel and their families from Crimea. On March 21st, after the ratification of the annexation treaty by the Russian parliament, Putin signed a law formally integrating Crimea into Russia. And that, ladies and non-ladies, is how the whole region was stolen by Russia. The subsequent years saw a militarization and siphoning off of Crimea's resources, revealing Putin's true intent all along. As if that wasn't enough, 2022 saw Russia going back to bully Ukraine under the guise of, well, several excuses.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major
full-scale invasion on multiple fronts.
Ukraine is now a nation at war.
A full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine woke to explosions around the capital, Kiev.
In the last few hours, they've gone from being civilians to now being soldiers having to fight on the front line.
Sudden as it was brutal and relentless, Ukrainians woke up to find themselves
has turned now into an invasion.
Military trucks and tanks were seen moving into the city with white painted Z signs on ringing out here in Kiev and cities across this country.
Vladimir Putin warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with the Russian action will lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen.
What Putin called a military operation is now the biggest war since the end of the Second World War. Not content to let Ukraine be its option, Putin has been pouting every time Ukraine acts independently, just like a jealous big brother does when the younger brother is the cool one. Russia has been determined in telling Ukraine who to befriend, who to trade with, and what the future looks like. This has increased under the rule of Zelensky, who Putin does not have in his pocket, and hence the confrontations and the invasion. On the 24th of February 2022, Putin sent troops into Ukraine from the north, south, and east with the purpose of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. His declared aim was to protect people subjected to what he called 8 years of bullying and genocide by Ukraine's government, claims which have no basis in evidence. Again, Putin was using the same card he used to annex Crimea, and this time he was applying it to the whole dang country. It was framed as an attempt to prevent NATO from gaining a foothold in Ukraine. These claims that Putin made of Nazis and genocide in eastern Ukraine were completely unfounded, but they have formed part of a narrative repeated by Russia since its proxy forces seized parts of the eastern regions of the country in 2014, triggering a war with Ukrainian forces. It's like no one knows what Putin is talking about except Putin himself. It's clear that Putin wants Ukraine, and he is willing to go to war over it. I'm really even hesitant to call this part of the video a border crisis, because the man doesn't want a part of Ukraine, he wants all of it. From time to time, he hid behind Ukraine's desires to join NATO, claiming that Ukraine joining NATO would be a threat to Russian security. However, in March of last year, Ukraine's president, Zelensky, publicly accepted that joining NATO would not happen. He offered that Ukraine become a non-aligned, non-nuclear state, but negotiations broke down. I say broke down, but it's clear that despite getting what he asked for, Putin has no interest in peace. Perhaps he thought he could take over Ukraine without much challenge, or that he could intimidate a surrender. But, oh well, it seems that things are not going that well for him. The Ukrainian resistance has been much steeper and harder than he thought. Soon, it'll be a year since he started his costly and devastating military operation that is hurting his economy more than he would care to admit. My prayers and thoughts are with all the victims of this war. Such conflicts have no winners, just losers. Russia has had a few other minor disputes as well. There are several of these with countries you would not even expect. Let me run you through them. Let's begin with their arch nemesis, the United States of America. Russia challenges the US over the ownership of Alaska. Alaska became the 49th state of the US in 1959, and it's located in the northwest region of North America. It was acquired by the United States in 1867 from Russia. However, the challenge is that most Russian nationalists don't recognize the sale of Alaska. They either claim that Russia never got paid, or that it was only a 99-year lease that ended decades ago. It all really depends on who you're listening to. The point is that Russia wants Alaska back. And, well, I just don't see that happening, do you? Although the USSR and the US signed a USSR-USA maritime boundary agreement, Russia now refuses to recognize it. Russia demands huge swaths of ocean and possibly some islands, and even all of Alaska as payment. Crazy, isn't it? In addition, many Russians also lay claim to Hawaii and Northern California because Russia had some military presence there in the 19th century. These claims are loose at best and unfounded at their worst, but hey, who knows? Maybe the US Congress might wake up feeling generous. Whilst we are still in North America, Russia also has a maritime border dispute with Canada. Russia claims some kind of exclusive rights to a huge part of the Arctic Ocean that are not Russian, according to any international treaties. In the past, the Russian Navy has promised to sink foreign ships that dare to set course through their waters. The list continues. Next on Russia's list of disputes is Norway. The Soviet Union occupied a small part of Finnmark, Norway, at the end of the Second World War. After the war ended, however, Russia refused to return it. Look, whoever taught Moscow that once you touch something it's yours, doomed us all. This is one of the lighter border disputes, because though Norway demands the land returned, they're not very pushy about it. This is in large part because the land is worthless. Makes you wonder why Russia would even risk diplomatic relations by holding on to something useless. Russia has even gotten as bold as to feel offended when Norway conducts its business on its islands and outposts. This headline from 2020 is a perfect summation of their entitlement. Not to say that any country does not have the right to enforce its own border rules, but it's interesting to note the countries that Russia has beef with. And you might not guess the next country on this list, so let me just go ahead and tell you, it's Finland. During the Second World War, something that is becoming a bit of a trend in this discussion, Russia annexed about 10% of Finnish territory. To this day, that land is not returned, and the Finns want it back. Russia's border issues involve other countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus. The story is mostly the same: historical territories that Russia refuses to relinquish. In certain situations, like when Latvia and Estonia joined the EU, they were forced to resolve their outstanding territorial disputes, with no other choice but to comply. Their governments signed agreements with Russia, giving up the stolen territories. The overall issue is the same. Russia is not up for territory negotiation, especially with former Soviet states. Even in the present day, Russia is operating as if it is the Soviet Union, something that does not surprise anyone, given that unifying all former states of Russia is Putin's dream. I started the video with Russia's disputes with Japan and China, as they're subjects that are not spoken about enough. However, as you have seen throughout this video, Russia has had, and in some cases still has, a lot of issues with several countries. These conflicts, if Ukraine has taught us anything, are seconds away from becoming military problems. We, as a global community, must keep ourselves alert to various extremes that may happen. Like Ukraine showed us, it quite literally can happen to anyone. So, my last video was demonetized, again. If you haven't seen it, it's no surprise. Whenever a video gets demonetized, YouTube usually bans it too. So, it was probably never shown to you. If you're wondering why it's demonetized, well, let me tell you. For the simple fact that it's covering the CCP's mistreatment of Uyghurs. Apparently, shedding light on this is a sensitive topic and can't be monetized. I don't know, it's extremely frustrating because this is now the second video covering the CCP's unjust actions that have been demonetized. The first one was about the CCP's illegal occupation of Tibet. So I'm starting to see a trend here. Every time I shed light on stuff that exposes the CCP, the video is quickly demonetized and suppressed. But fortunately for me, I don't have to depend on YouTube monetization because of my patrons. That's why I have no plans to stop covering topics that make the CCP and YouTube unhappy. If you enjoy my coverage and want to support my future videos that uncover sensitive topics like these, please consider supporting the videos on Patreon. The link is in the description. Without the support of my patrons, honestly, these videos wouldn't be possible. So I am so eternally grateful to you guys. Thank you so much for everything. On the 24th of February last year, Russia took an aggressive stance and invaded Ukraine, which was a major escalation of their border conflict. This war, which just hit its one-year anniversary as of this recording, has caused devastating effects globally. Both Russia and Ukraine have suffered heavy losses, and the whole world has been dragged into this messy situation. The US is giving out billions in loans to Ukraine, while EU nations are sending a lot of arms to the nation to help out with the war effort. It seems like it's a lot of expenditures and losses on all sides. One country, however, has risen to a triumphant grace in the middle of all this commotion. That one country is not losing, but gaining heavily from this global conflict. That nation is none other than Qatar.
Qatar's energy minister has announced a long-term deal to supply gas to Germany.
China's Sinopec has signed a $60 billion agreement with Qatar Energy.
2 million tons of liquefied natural gas will be delivered annually.
Oil and gas, the cornerstones of Qatar's economy.
Prices are so high that the deliverers of energy like Qatar are the ones who want long-term contracts.
As we shed some light on one of the lesser-known gems of the world, please take a moment to shed some light on this video by liking it. Your 2-second action will go a long way towards helping with the algorithm. Alright, let's get into it. This is Qatar. It's a Middle Eastern country blessed with vast supplies of natural gas, making the nation ridiculously wealthy. Despite being home to just about 3 million citizens, Qatar has gas reserves that, at 858 trillion cubic feet, account for about 12% of the world's total natural gas reserves. To put this into some perspective, this gives Qatar the 3rd largest natural gas reserve, and it makes it one of the top 3 natural gas exporting nations, along with the United States and Australia. Quite an achievement for the small nation, and one they have leveraged quite nicely. In fact, many people did not know Qatar before the 2022 World Cup, where the small nation shined by hosting what was the largest and most extravagant World Cup in history. I'm not joking. Qatar spent over $200 billion on this 30-day affair, a figure that far eclipses the previous amounts spent. In fact, Qatar spent over 12 times as much as the previous spending record holder. I say all this to show you just how wealthy Qatar has gotten off its gas. And now, I'll show you just how the Ukraine conflict is making them even richer. It's safe to say that if there ever was a winner to be named out of this horrible conflict, it is undoubtedly Qatar. To understand Qatar's advantage, we have to look at what the oil and gas supply chain used to be like. Russia was a big exporter of gas to Europe. Having the largest natural gas reserves in the world, Russia had an ample market and ample supply. In 2021, before the war started, Russia was supplying EU countries with 40% of their natural gas, with Germany being the largest importer. Other nations like Italy and the Netherlands imported an exorbitant amount of gas too. This chart shows just how much of a chokehold Russia had on Europe, and how much they were making off of Europe's pockets. Their aggressive international policy, however, did have an effect on this. Once Russia invaded Ukraine, its diplomatic relations with Europe were pretty heavily affected. By August of 2022, Europe was importing just about 17% of their gas from Russia. That figure has continuously dwindled over time. This presented quite a problem. Europe still needs a lot of gas, and they don't want to fund Russia's war by buying Russian gas. What's the answer? Qatar. You see, Qatar is presenting itself as the solution to all of Europe's natural gas problems. Qatar has placed itself in a position where it solves a problem and also benefits pretty heavily in the process. And it's not just with Europe alone, oh no, it is benefiting from China as well. In a way, Qatar is robbing Russia of all of its customers and outlets, all while making billions in the process. You see, what Saudi Arabia is in the world of oil, Qatar is in the world of gas. What makes Qatar's situation even more royal is that when it comes to gas, it has it in spades. Qatar has proven reserves equivalent to 609.2 times its annual consumption. This means it has about 609 years of gas left at current consumption levels. That's no small blessing. It means that Qatar will be able to sell gas for longer and in more quantities in comparison to its rivals, those being the US and Australia. While Australia is starting to see its reserves dwindle, Qatar has so much more to explore and take advantage of. And given its neat diplomatic ties, it outshines countries like Russia too, who, though they possess more gas, have muddled reputations. Honestly, all fingers just point towards the small nation right now. Ben Cahill, an energy expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, rightfully said, "This is Qatar's moment. Everyone needs them now." And he couldn't have been more correct. Qatar itself seems to sense this, and they have doubled down on natural gas production. Despite being the largest liquefied natural gas exporter at the moment, Qatar is growing even bigger. Last year, the country announced the North Field East project. This is a project aimed at increasing liquefied natural gas production globally, and the project itself is the world's largest liquefied natural gas project ever in terms of capacity. That says a lot. Qatar has been serious about expanding its liquefied natural gas production from the North Field, which is the world's single largest non-associated offshore natural gas field. The nation began the construction of 4 giant liquefied natural gas production lines with a capacity of 8 million tons each per year. This is in addition to gas-producing facilities, natural gas liquids recovery, and helium extraction and refining facilities in Ras Laffan Industrial City. These investments will increase its export capacity by more than a third by 2026. In fact, when the project is complete, it will be churning out about 1.4 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. Put together, the project will raise the country's liquefied natural gas production capacity from 77 million tons annually to 110 million tons. That's all dollar bills, as far as I can see. Qatari officials have also announced plans to build 2 more terminals later in the decade. When you factor it all in, by the time everything is said and done, the country's capacity to produce liquid natural gas will grow more than 60% to 126 million tons a year later in the decade. This is the biggest doubling down action I have ever seen. In addition to liquefied natural gas, the project will produce condensate, LPG, ethane, sulfur, and helium. All this just means extra profits for Qatar. This is money upon money upon more money for Qatar. The Arab nation is betting that even as much of the world is trying to cut greenhouse gas emissions, demand for liquefied natural gas will keep growing. That's because many elected leaders and energy experts believe the fuel is essential as a replacement for coal and to back up solar and wind energy, which can be limited by inclement weather. That fear, or rather need for consistency on their nation's energy needs, is Qatar's winning bet. Well, just how viable is this gamble, you may ask? Well, let me show you.
Negotiate a long-term energy partnership. Germany's reliance on Russian gas has exposed Europe's biggest economy.
Is a milestone toward what he calls Putin-free energy.
Qatar's state energy company seals a 27-year deal to supply China's Sinopec with liquefied natural gas. Qatar Energy will send 4 million tons of LNG annually to China's
expansion projects, respectively, will start in 2026.
Just last year, Qatar signed a mega deal with German firms. The 15-year deal is for Qatar to supply Germany with over 2 million tons of liquid gas. This deal is set to start in 2026, the same year that Qatar's new expansion project ends. As Germany has begun weaning itself off of Russian gas, Qatar is coming to save the day. Now, granted, Qatar has faced some scrutiny from Europe regarding its workforce and LGBTQ violations, scrutiny that rose particularly during the World Cup, as you may remember. However, whatever scrutiny they may face, it pales in comparison to the crimes that Russia is currently committing. So in European eyes, Qatar is by far the safer option. On the other hand, Qatar is guaranteed a market for its gas for the foreseeable future. Again, it's not just selling to Europe either. The Middle Eastern nation has also penned quite the deal with China. Last year, Qatar and China also agreed to a $60 billion, 27-year deal for liquefied natural gas. Yeah, you heard that right. That's billion with a B. And yes, I did say 27-year deal. This monumental deal, which guarantees the export of 4 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually to China, is notable for several reasons. Firstly, as the longest liquefied natural gas supply contract signed to date, it signifies that long-term oil-indexed liquefied natural gas supply contracts are still an essential method for buyers to ensure the security of their supply, and for suppliers to maintain the security of demand. This is in tandem with Qatar doubling down on its infrastructure and building more refineries. Guaranteeing long-term contracts like this gives them that boldness because they have a guaranteed market for their gas. Also, securing these types of contracts is a big deal because it shows that, despite predictions that the world going green will phase out Qatar's relevance quickly, this does not seem to be the case at all. In fact, Qatar's relevance and geopolitical importance has only shot up even higher, as they are a stable gas supply for Europe. And this is during a time when the continent is heavily struggling to reduce its dependence on Russia, and as other countries increase their natural gas consumption in a bid to decarbonize their macroeconomics. Qatar is essentially the best friend who worms their way into your heart after your breakup with your long-term partner. Always there, always reliable until boom, one day you wake up naked together in a bed after a long night of partying. Yeah, you get the idea. Qatar's energy minister and Qatar's energy CEO said in a statement that the deal opens a new and exciting chapter with China. Best believe the minister is not just talking about the money in this deal. Qatar is gaining far more than financial benefits. You see, at the present moment, Qatar already provides China with 1/4 of its gas. That number is rising quickly with the addition of new deals being signed between these nations. What this does is that it makes Qatar very important to China, as anything pertaining to this gas provision becomes essentially China's business. Despite China reducing dependency on Russian gas and the uncertainties that it brings, China is also casting its own lot with Qatar. For Qatar, this means that an additional layer of security has been formed as the nation's two interests are aligned. This 27-year deal gives Qatar more protection from its enemies, not least among them a potentially hostile Iran, with which Qatar shares one of the largest gas fields in the world. Qatar has long relied on a U.S. military base near Doha as a bulwark. But as some lawmakers in the United States grow wary of foreign entanglements, experts say Qatar is looking for an additional buffer against Iran. And that buffer is now China. It's always a win when you secure an important energy customer and a geopolitical partner in the same breath. I mean, talk about a win-win. Boosting international relations and fattening your pockets simultaneously? According to Citigroup projections, the country's economy will grow at 4.4%, the fastest pace since 2015. Meanwhile, Qatar's GDP per capita, with a population of less than 3 million, will reach $77,000, thus reaching levels similar to that of Switzerland. That puts the nation in a very nice niche. So, where does this leave the matter? Well, Qatar is emerging as quite the regional figure and an important geopolitical player in the modern world. On top of befriending both the West and the East, Qatar is actively helping other nations like Egypt, and this serves to heighten Qatar's regional role. Also, with the signing and cementing of all these deals, and many more to come, Qatar has quite comfortably. Russia is running out of people. During the first 5 months of 2022, Russia's population fell by 430,000. And another study points to another decline of more than 1 million people for 2022 as a whole. For an economy of that size, that is devastating. As you might already know, things aren't exactly going smoothly for Russia. Between the domestic disputes at home, loss of international support, and Ukraine's army gaining ground on the battlefield, Putin seems to be losing on all fronts.
Vladimir Putin.
Russia's attacks.
Russia, spurred by Vladimir Putin.
Russia has now reported a record decline of more than 1 million people.
Explosions at Russian air bases deep inside the country. The incidents could be a major escalation in the war, which so far has largely remained inside the borders of Ukraine.
President Putin put the country on an unsustainable path.
You see, in addition to these challenges, Russia is in a major population crisis. A crisis that might mean the end of Russia as we know it. So severe is this problem that Putin himself has had to go into public to say, demography is the first task. We should have more people, and they should be healthy. Yes, that is just how intense Russia's population crisis is. So how does a population crisis spell the end of Russia? How do demographic challenges pose a big problem at all to Russia? In this video, I'll answer all those questions and more. Brace yourselves as I do not have good news for Mother Russia. The problem of population is not a new one to Russia, but it has intensified in recent times due to various factors that we'll talk about in just a minute. You see, for the past 30 years, Russia's population has been in a steep decline. This is from the time when the Soviet Union fell and heavy destabilization took place. In 1991, at the time of the Soviet collapse, the population in Russia numbered around 148.2 million inhabitants. Just last year, however, the population of Russia was at 143.4 million, according to the World Bank. Alain Blum, the demographer at the National Institute for Demographic Studies in France, is on record saying, Russia is paying the cost of the 90s. When the Soviet Union fell, the country plunged into a serious demographic crisis. For the first time, Russia's mortality rate was significantly exceeding its birth rate, leading to a decline in its population. Putting it together means that Russia has not grown in 30 years, but more than that, it has declined pretty significantly. This has left the Russian Federation with a population pyramid like this. And you don't need me to tell you that it spells trouble for this nation. Once you have the older populations outpacing the younger, the future of a nation becomes compromised, as you will soon see. At the rate at which the population decline is taking place, one can only wonder what Russia will look like another 30 years from now. To make a bad situation worse, the COVID pandemic also worsened the crisis, as Russia suffered among the world's highest fatalities. That helped cut average life expectancy to levels seen a decade ago within the nation. While the epidemic has since subsided and is now largely contained globally, there is still no sign of a turnaround in population decline, as opposed to what's happening in other countries. In fact, there has been a decline in the population by 700,000 people from the beginning of 2021 to the beginning of 2022. That's because the other factors that are contributing to the population crisis are still in full effect. What are those factors? Let's take a look. This one ties in with the collapse of the Soviet Union. When you look at this population pyramid, you can tell that during the 90s, when the Soviets fell, there were very few births in comparison to what was expected. This is because of the lack of stability during that period. As is human nature, people tend to have larger families when they feel safe, secure, and stable. And, well, the 90s in Russia were anything but that. The effect of this is that now, the people of childbearing age are those who were born during that period. Because there were a lot fewer of them, there simply aren't enough of them to drive population growth upwards. This means lower birth rates continue. It's a harsh cycle that keeps births shrinking and the population shrinking even further. Unlike Russia, whose reach is shrinking, how about we increase the reach of our Business Basics family, huh? Please drop a like or comment on this video. I greatly appreciate it. Okay, while we're on the subject of births, at present, the fertility rate in Russia is staggeringly low. Just so we're all on the same page, the fertility rate is the number of children born alive to women of that age during the year as a proportion of the average annual population of women of the same age. That was quite a mouthful. To maintain a healthy population, the fertility rate should be 2.1 going up. Do you want to know about Russia? Well, let's take a look at this chart for your answer. Their fertility rate is just below 1.5 children per woman, far below the 2.1 children needed to maintain the population at existing levels. Russia can't even maintain its population, let alone grow it. Putin is well aware of this and has in recent years tried to put measures that encourage people to have more children. In 2017, Vladimir Putin announced the implementation of a program for assisting families, to provide an allowance for the first child for families whose income is at a certain level. That grant is paid monthly to the children for 18 months, aiding the parents in supporting the family. Putin also extended the Maternity Capital Program, a program introduced in 2007 to assist families with their children. This is done through a lump sum payment of $7,700 to the family. Now, all these measures are meant to encourage the increase of traditional family size and thus to, boost the population. Well, despite his efforts, these measures have not been met with much success. Russia remains in the population crisis it is in. However, low birth rates are not the only reason for Russia's woe. Let's look at another factor: immigration. Let's start with a definition of terms, shall we? Emigration is the relocation or process of people leaving one country to reside in another. We're all on the same page now, right? Okay, good. Emigration is currently one of the main problems that Russia is facing. People are simply leaving the country. According to official statistics from Al Jazeera, nearly 4 million Russians left the country in the first 3 months of 2022. People emigrate for many reasons, including increasing one's chance of employment or improving their quality of life. It's not hard to imagine why many people are leaving Russia right now, especially in light of this year's invasion of Ukraine. Due to fear that the war might escalate to affect the homeland, and also due to several large companies closing their branches in Russia, the Federation is experiencing heavy emigration. It is not just simple emigration, though. It is better termed Russia's brain drain. The Federation is losing its best and brightest to other nations because of the instability at home. According to the Financial Times, some 150,000 people working in new, specialized technologies have fled the country. As tech firms lose access to services, customers, and payments, some tech companies with headquarters in other countries have chartered planes to airlift their employees and other specialists. The destination of these talented exiles are the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Others have gone to Turkey, Israel, or the former Soviet republics in the Caucasus and Central Asia. When you consider that these are mostly working-class, highly educated youth, the impact on Russia's economy will be felt, without a doubt. Imagine educating a generation, and when it comes time for them to add value to the economy, they just leave. Ouch. I doubt anyone can accurately quantify it now, but all that's for sure is, besides affecting the population's dynamic, it will heavily impact Russia's economy in the future. At this point, the Kremlin has to wonder if they have to change their policies, because you can't feign ignorance when this much high-value manpower is being lost. Even Putin, as unyielding as he is, in March, signed a bill granting exemptions for army service and income tax for tech workers. That was in a bid to stop them from leaving, but oh well, can't really say that it worked. Angelina Davidova, a Russian environmental journalist, said, "The current invasion of Ukraine destroys not only one country, but two." This is the best way to phrase what's been happening. A lot of the facts I've talked about in the past few minutes all tie in together with this invasion. It has served a major catalyst for what was already a severe population crisis. A lot of analysts seem to think that Putin's invasion was particularly a mask aimed at solving the population crisis. At least in part. You see, Ukraine has a population of 44 million people who are mostly of Slavic descent from the former Soviet bloc. For Putin, the invasion was not only about capturing territory he believes belongs to Russia, but also about gaining control over a population he wants to integrate into the country. This can be evidenced by the latest population census, where Moscow has included the 2.4 million inhabitants of the Donbass, parts of which were administered by pro-Russia separatists before the current invasion. Russia is basically claiming people as its citizens now. For several weeks, the Kremlin has also decided to refocus its efforts on the east of Ukraine with one objective in mind: organizing local referendums on potential integration into Russia. They are adding territory to the Federation. But most importantly to them, they are bringing human resources. It's crazy to imagine the inner workings of the mind of Putin. However, this war has not been entirely, if at all, favorable to Russia. For starters, whatever pro-family policies Putin has been working on for the past several years, he has just undone it in this one political act of war. The instability that comes with war is exactly the same kind of scenario from 1991 that resulted in few births in post-Soviet-era Russia. Elena Churilova, a research fellow in the Higher School Economics International Laboratory for Population and Health, says, "It's likely that in conditions of uncertainty, many couples will postpone having children for some time until the situation stabilizes." This sentiment is echoed by Alexei Raksha, a Russian demographer, who says, "In 2023, we are likely to see a further decline in the birth rate. During economic crises, people are less inclined to have children, which is logical. Trust in the future plays a key role in a country's birth rate." Did you hear that? Trust plays an important role in having children, and right now, the Russian Federation is void of trust. It is very likely that going into 2023, there will be even fewer births as a result of this war. If this war goes on for years, this low birth scenario will stretch out for years, creating another generation of low births. This is not just random guessing. According to Rosstat, this year, as a result of the war, reported a 5% drop in births in the first quarter of 2022 compared to last year. When you couple this shocking information with the number of deaths that happened on the battlefield, well, it doesn't make for a pretty picture. The numbers are not quite clear, with different sources stating different things, but Western officials estimated at least 15,000 Russian troops have died in the war so far. Ukraine claims that the actual number is 30,000. If the war stretches on for years, this number will keep climbing higher, only making a bad situation worse. Let's also keep in mind that this war is expensive, and with the sanctions imposed on Russia, it will not be surprising to see them cut off their pro-family incentives due to limited finances. With the resistance that Ukraine is putting up, this is likely to be a realistic scenario. Putin has shot himself in the foot, it would seem. Let's be honest. The truth is that Russia is in trouble. It is facing a population decline and a massive brain drain that threatens to cripple the economy for many years to come. All this is simultaneously happening at a time when they are fighting what seems to be an unwinnable war. Already, years of growth have been washed away from the Russian economy, and the longer this goes on, the more the consequences. It really looks like Putin bit off more than he could chew, and much like the demographics of Russia, he is choking hard. Only time will tell if, much like the Soviet Union, Russia will collapse onto itself. At the start of 2022, rumors of Sweden and Finland considering joining NATO had started appearing in the mainstream media. Russia is pushing Finland and Sweden toward NATO. Finland and Sweden are done with deference to Russia. These rumors received a lot of criticism, as Russia was still portrayed as a very powerful country with a military that could march all the way to Paris, if only given the reason. Little did the critics know, the Russians can always find a reason. And if they actually could stage a successful invasion, or rather if they thought they could stage one, they wouldn't hesitate. Chances are, the closer you live to Russia, the more obvious this seems to you. Finland shares a 1,300-kilometer, about 833-mile, border with Russia. And it seems like the logic applies to both it and its immediate neighbors to the west. Less than 3 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership together. But was this really a sudden U-turn, or rather, a logical ending to a decades-long process? In this video, we're going to talk about exactly that. This is by far my longest video ever, and it took a really long time to make. So, if you appreciate the effort, can you please hit that like button? It would mean the world to me, and it would help out this video a lot with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks. The history of Sweden's and Finland's neutrality stems from as early as 1809, when, as a result of the Finnish War between the Kingdom of Sweden and the Russian Empire, Finland was made into an autonomous part of Russia. And from there, the story of these two Scandinavian regions have quite a lot of differences, so we'll cover them separately. In 1917, Finland declared independence after the Russians were weakened by the February Revolution and then the October Revolution. Shortly after, though, because of the century-long history of Finland being a part of Russia, a mirror image of the empire's civil unrest started to emerge in Finland itself. Conservative whites, backed by the Tsarist Russians, and socialist Reds, backed by Bolshevik Russians, fought a devastating war, which ended after the German Empire intervened at the whites' request. The whites won in Finland, but their main supporters from Russia lost to the Bolsheviks, and the German occupiers lost the World War. The radical Reds in Finland were already marginalized, so instead of igniting a new war, this turned out to be the best possible outcome for the Finns. It allowed their country to start breaking away from the severe Russian influences that caused the Civil War in the first place, and it prevented Germans from occupying the region for too long. Independent Finland was slowly recovering under the control of whites. As the war-torn country was slowly yet steadily healing its wounds, a new cruel invasion was about to start from the east. In late 1939, the Winter War broke out. During that time, the Finns defended their country fiercely, but could not stage a large-scale counteroffensive. This resulted in the Moscow Peace Treaty, which the Finns were, to say the least, not satisfied with. Because of this, Finland now sought help from Germany, which was unsatisfied with the outcome of the Winter War in its own way. Invading the Soviet Union was not a good strategic decision, though. Thankfully for the entire world, the Wehrmacht was defeated. Finland was still at its 1940 border, but now it was not in the position to complain. The hatred for Russians was there, but the Russians themselves were just over the border. Any intentions of allying with the USA were enough of a reason for the Soviets to initiate yet another war. The only viable way for the Finns to save their democracy and independence was neutrality. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was fairly good at posing as a country that Europe shouldn't worry about. The two Russian invasions of Chechnya received little to no attention from the Western media. The invasion of Georgia ended quickly and with little casualties. Syria is simply too far away to care about. And the Russians made the land grab of Crimea and Donbass complicated enough for most people in the West to stop forming their opinion at a point where they needed knowledge of a sizable chunk of Ukrainian history. Learning all that, on top of their other activities, was understandably just too much, so they believed in the possibility of a peaceful resolution, or at least maintaining the status quo. Secretly, though, the Cold War never ended for Finland. But in the eyes of the public, Russia wasn't that dangerous. Why don't we just stay neutral, as always? Surely we don't want to be the provocateurs. Sweden, unlike Finland, didn't lose its sovereignty at the start of the 19th century. After it lost control over Finland, it joined the Allies to fight against Napoleon and defeated the Danes in 1813. As a result, Denmark ceded Norway to the Swedes. In the next year, Norway tried to declare independence, but was invaded by Sweden again. For the rest of the century, Norway stayed independent except for its foreign affairs, which were controlled by the Swedish king. In the First World War, after Norway declared full independence, the Swedish foreign policy was not really neutral. It was more like slightly siding with different powers at different stages of the war. Between 1920 and 1939, though, the country's efforts were focused on avoiding German and Soviet influence. When World War II started, this policy persisted. Despite being surrounded by German allies and occupied states, it managed to stay neutral at the little expense of providing Germany with a passage to Norway and trading steel with it. This neutrality policy was highly popular among the Swedes, so it's only natural that the country had no intention of joining NATO throughout the course of the Cold War. It did accept the Marshall Plan funding, though, unlike Finland. Neutrality is often associated with peace, or even freedom from participating in wars. In reality, it's not that simple. To maintain neutrality, a country must either be able to defend itself from an invasion of a superior power, or become allies with stronger nations, but indirectly, without angering their enemies. As with everything, in Sweden and Finland's case, it's a mix of both. But let's see what this mix is really all about. First, let's look at the defense spending. Sweden's military spending has been in a steady decline from 4% of its GDP in 1960 to just 1.3% in 2021, which is far less than the NATO target of 2%. Finland, being closer to the danger zone, didn't have that luxury. So it goes to figure that in the same period, it didn't really change that much and fluctuated around 2%. But when looking at the raw numbers adjusted for inflation, we can see quite a different picture. This chart more or less shows the real dynamics of how much Sweden invested in its military over the last 60 years. We can clearly see that this number only started a long-term decline in 1992, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. As for Finland, though, similar trends can be seen, but only in the last decade. And in 2004, it almost completely negated. Perhaps its government sensed that the Russians were preparing for a new attempt at restoring their empire? The Finns knew it all, didn't they? Well, it may have been one of the key reasons, but it's certainly not the only one. As of 2021, Finland and Sweden have the 15th and 12th biggest military budgets in Europe, respectively. They are an order of magnitude smaller than those of the UK, France, or Germany, but still enough to maintain rather capable armies. So, what are these armies really made of? Sweden's population is 10.5 million people. Among them, 2 million males and 1.6 million females between the ages of 18 and 47 are considered fit for military service. Notably, Sweden is one of the few countries where conscription is mandatory and gender neutral. The size of the regular army is relatively small at just under 23.6 thousand active personnel and 31,000 in reserves. The Swedish army possesses 121 German Leopard tanks, 1,300 Finnish and 800 domestically produced armored vehicles of various types, and around 170 mortar and artillery guns, all of which were also produced in Finland or Sweden. The country's navy has a few submarines, corvettes, large patrol boats, and around 350 smaller vessels. All of that originates from Sweden, and some of the small boats like the CB-90 were even exported to various countries. Where the Swedish armed forces really shine is their air force, which has over 200 aircraft, among which 94 are fighter jets made by Saab. You might recognize this name if you know a thing or two about the automobile industry. But this Saab hasn't had much to do with cars since 1990, when the automobile division was spun off and sold to General Motors in 2 steps. The defense Saab, however, is doing well. And apparently it also has a really nice website that strangely makes you feel like they just sell mugs and t-shirts. Anyway, the reason why Sweden has such a disproportionately strong air force compared to the other branches of their military is rather easy to understand. This is the Gotland Island. It's not only the biggest one in the Baltic Sea, but also one of the most conveniently located islands there. Less than 300 kilometers to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, and at the same time, less than 700 kilometers to St. Petersburg. All while being separated from Russia with hundreds of kilometers of water, Gotland is one of the key strategic points in the region. During the Cold War, it held even more importance as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were occupied by the Soviet Union, connecting Kaliningrad to Russia proper. The island, sometimes referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, had to be protected with a very strong air force. Another very important factor that encouraged Sweden to expand this department of the army was the region next to the west coast, where American nuclear submarines were located in the early 1960s. A strong Swedish air force was necessary to keep Soviet anti-submarine aircraft from operating in the missile launch area. Around this time, its size was about 1,000 planes, the 4th largest in the world. With Finland, however, the situation is quite different. The primary purpose of its military is stopping a potential land invasion from the east. Since the Finnish defense forces are designed for, well, defense of Finland only, there's no real need to maintain a sizable army at all times. With a population of 5.5 million, it has 1.5 million men between the ages of 18 and 60 available for service. Women may also join the military, but voluntarily. The size of the regular army of Finland is just 23.8 thousand active personnel in peacetime, only 200 more than Sweden. During wartime, however, this number would be increased to 280,000, almost by a factor of 12. The size of the reserves is also staggering, 900,000 personnel. This army's equipment is also far different from that of Sweden. Apart from 239 German Leopard tanks and almost 1,200 armored vehicles, it has 800 artillery systems, 76 rocket launchers, 146 missile systems. You get the idea. There's a lot of land-based stuff. The Finnish Navy, though, doesn't have that many ships. Still, there are 4 corvettes, 8 missile boats, and over 100 small transport ships. The Air Force of Finland is just a bit smaller than that of Sweden, but is still by no means small at 164 operational aircraft, among which 55 are fighter jets. What's interesting about these numbers, though, is the origin of all this equipment. Sweden's possessions, apart from the tanks, are almost entirely produced domestically or in Finland. Finland itself has equipment from all around Europe, as well as the Soviet Union. One of the reasons for that is economics. The Swedish government could just be hesitant to increase its military spending because it's not that beneficial to the economy, unless it's investing in domestic production or for the benefit of its neighbor, the country that would most likely be attacked first in the case of a war with Russia. Finland, on the other hand, just needs the most modern stuff. It's cool to encourage domestic production, but not when you have better options and a neighbor with an unpredictable past. Another reason is, well, Finland just doesn't have a company like Saab. Its defense companies are dwarfed by the Swedish giant, and I'm not even going to compare them to what the US has. So, having bigger needs for equipment and smaller production capabilities, Finland just chooses to buy rather than to produce at home. Speaking of buying, surely these countries don't do much more than that to appear neutral in the eyes of everyone? Finland stayed almost completely neutral during the Cold War, apart from buying equipment from both the Warsaw Pact and NATO countries. In 1995, all of this changed when the country politically and economically allied with the West, joining the EU together with Sweden and Austria. Militarily, however, a shift in Finland's policy occurred as early as 1994, when it joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program. One Finnish battalion was sent to help NATO's peacekeeping mission in Bosnia in 1996, and since 1999, over 7,000 Finns have served in the KFOR operation in Kosovo. Finnish forces also worked alongside Allied forces in Afghanistan and then Iraq. A consensus about joining NATO was nowhere to be seen, but the membership option was kept on the table since as early as the mid-1990s. Gradually, Finland intensified its NATO collaboration and geared its defense forces towards full interoperability. In 2014, Russia took Crimea without asking. So a year later, Finland joined NATO's Enhanced Opportunities Partners program along with Sweden and 3 other nations. This Enhanced Opportunities Partners thing has never been given a real definition. So we have to think of it as an initiative which would offer specific benefits that are tailor-made to meet each of these 5 countries' interests. Sounds boring, and well, that's by design. It's more like saying, look, we're doing something productive but not provocative. It's just peace and friendship stuff. But because of bureaucracy, you won't understand much, as always. Nobody's joining NATO, you can move on with your lives, and Russia shouldn't worry either. Since 1991, Sweden was drifting away from neutrality almost identically to Finland. We'll not go through that again. What is worth covering, though, is Sweden's cooperation with the West during the Cold War. Initially, right after World War II ended, rulers of Sweden and Finland were expressing interest in creating a neutral alliance of North European countries. This idea was soon forgotten, as NATO was founded with Norway and Denmark being among the first 12 members. Therefore, Sweden maintained its neutrality policy, fearing that the Soviet Union might respond by invading Finland, which was definitely not favorable. This neutrality policy was nothing like Finlandization, though. In the late 1940s, Finland quietly tried to start an independent nuclear program, involving production of plutonium and acquisition of nuclear secrets from all nuclear powers. This initiative was scrapped as too costly. A nation with such a small budget and so little manpower simply could not compete with the nuclear powers. Similar thoughts about neutrality in general were often expressed. Sweden's leaders understood that, in a Third World War, neutral countries would be seen as easy prey rather than a party that the fighting powers would not care about. So there was a lot of cooperation between them and the US. In the late 1940s and early 50s, Sweden built very close ties to both NATO and the United States. It was deeply involved in Cold War spying operations, as well as secretly given security guarantees. The military cooperation also included providing much help with the development of the fighter jet Saab 37 Viggen, which is part of why Sweden's defense industry is doing much better than Finland's. Swedish scientists, in turn, helped enhance the accuracy of the Polaris nuclear missiles. And yes, these are the ones that were carried by submarines near the west coast of the country. They didn't just happen to be there because of Denmark and Norway. The US relied on Sweden to cover the airspace next to these submarines. And on top of that, every publicly available war games training included the scenario that if Sweden was under attack from the Soviets, it would rely on NATO forces for defense. That's some pretty strong cooperation. And knowing all of this, it's really hard to see Sweden as a neutral state. So, a lot has been going on behind the scenes as ordinary people were thinking of Finland and Sweden as just neutral countries. Not many were aware that only one piece of the NATO membership puzzle was missing, and ironically, this last piece was the awareness itself. But it's never an easy task to make people agree on something that has been controversial for decades. On the scale of an entire nation, it might just be impossible to do it from the inside. Though at the start of 2022, this problem was about to get solved in an instant. Logically, Russia's next move was not that hard to predict. The buildup of forces was not fake, with field hospitals and all sorts of other military infrastructure being set up on the border. The propaganda campaign was in full swing. It wasn't hard to believe Russia would invade Ukraine again, but it was hard to believe that it would launch a full-scale invasion on Europe's doorstep. And so, quite unexpectedly, not only did Russia invade in one of the most violent ways imaginable, but Ukraine was ready to fight back. Our armed forces are here. The citizens are here. We are all here. Defending our independence, our country. It will remain like this. In April of 2022, the Russians withdrew from the north of Ukraine. They were stopped by a far less experienced military with far more limited equipment. For a lot of people, this put an end to the debate of whether NATO was necessary after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not to mention, now that Russia is barely making any advances in Ukraine, it's not possible to launch yet another invasion into Finland. All of this means that now, the perfect opportunity to join NATO has emerged in front of the remaining non-allied Scandinavian nations. Shocking clips of atrocities done by the Russians, absurd claims and violent threats from the Russian state TV, stories of Ukrainian refugees, all of this changed the minds of millions of Finns and Swedes far better than any logical arguments could. The support for joining NATO skyrocketed in both Finland and Sweden. The fearful respect for the Russian armed forces just vaporized, as if it was never even there in the first place. It was replaced with memes about an army of uneducated marauders. Here's a clip of Finnish tractor drivers moving towards the eastern border. If the Russians invaded with their tanks, someone would have to tow them after they ran out of fuel, I guess. So, the public support for joining NATO is finally here. Awareness is not missing anymore. The puzzle is complete, and the next step can only be a formal application for NATO membership, which Finland and Sweden announced together on May 18th, 2022. One more request before moving on to part 2 of this video. If you enjoy videos like this, please consider supporting the video on Patreon. With YouTube's strict monetization requirement, a lot of my videos are restricted and demonetized. So all this is made possible mainly by the support of my patrons. So if you enjoy the videos, please check out my Patreon by clicking on the link in the description. For a lot of us, 2022 didn't start well. The world was only starting to recover from the pandemic, but not a lot of time was left before the start of a gruesome event that would make some people simply forget about COVID. While the common folk didn't believe in what was about to happen, those who knew were preparing to respond to the Russian invasion. This response was not limited to the immense fortitude of the Ukrainian army. It would be an understatement to say that the support Ukraine received from the West was unprecedented. But one act of solidarity stood out from the rest. It wasn't humanitarian aid, it wasn't a transfer of weapons, it wasn't even intended to be a gesture of support. And yet, the Ukrainians viewed it as one of the most inspiring and historic events of the century. You read the title. This event was Sweden and Finland's joint application for NATO membership. Yes, in retrospect, it sounds cool and epic, but it's taking a bit longer than the couple of months that some people expected from countries which would be pretty valuable to the alliance. So what happened? There are a few reasons why a country might have its NATO accession postponed. First, let's look at the minimum requirements for NATO membership. This is not the complete checklist, it's just a good baseline to start with. These 5 criteria are actually a piece of cake for Sweden and Finland. Look for yourself. Uphold democracy, including tolerance for diversity. I don't think there's much to say here. Check. Be progressing towards a market economy. Well, a lot of countries are looking up to the Nordic nations on this matter, so check. Have their military forces under firm civilian control. Yeah, also check. Be good neighbors and respect the sovereignty of other nations. Sweden and Finland don't even have any ongoing territorial disputes. There are the Åland Islands just to the southwest coast of Finland, which were disputed between, funnily enough, Finland and Sweden themselves over 100 years ago. The dispute was settled by the League of Nations in 1921, and the Swedish Prime Minister expressed their dissatisfaction with the conclusion, but also said Sweden would not use force to regain control over the islands. Now that a century has passed, this dispute is barely worth noting, so we can put a big ol' check mark here as well. And lastly, work towards interoperability with NATO forces. That's exactly what they've been doing for the last few decades, so check. But you might think that there's a 6th one. Keep the country's military budget at or above 2% of GDP. But it's more of a guideline than a requirement. In fact, only 10 of the 30 member states meet this target, and Iceland doesn't even have a military at all. For Finland and Sweden, though, it's one of the major considerations regarding their potential membership. If you are that close to the enemy of NATO, your army must be well-funded and be ready to defend against an invasion. Finland already meets this requirement, just like basically every possible requirement regarding military capabilities. Sweden, on the other hand, is having some problems with that. But it's nothing too major, since its government has already been steadily increasing its defense budget since 2018 and has the 2% goal in mind. So, this requirement is also not the real problem. What actually stops the accession from happening is the stance of other countries. The first country that comes to mind here is Russia. It's not a member of NATO, so on the legal side, it has nothing to do with accepting new members. However, if Russia doesn't like the prospect of a neighboring country joining the alliance, then a mysteriously repetitive sequence of events tends to take place. A separatist movement emerges out of nowhere, tries to create a new country next to the Russian border, and later gets recognized by only Russia and their puppet states. It's already happened in Georgia, then in Ukraine, and it's unlikely that Finland would be eager to repeat this experience. So what do the Russians think of these North European countries joining NATO? Well, it turns out, nothing to be afraid of. In Putin's speech from June of 2022, he signaled that it's ultimately okay if they join, but if NATO deploys military infrastructure and soldiers there, Russia would be obliged to respond symmetrically. Other Russian officials often talked about serious military and political consequences. But it's clear that they would first need to deal with the serious consequences they created in Ukraine before moving on to any other nations. Anyway, this position seems pretty nice overall, even suspiciously nice. Maybe that's because Russia doesn't have that much bargaining power anymore, or maybe the Russians are just very confident that the current NATO members won't be able to agree and accept the new states. It looks like the second option has been successful, so far. So, all 30 current member states must accept the new countries into the alliance. As this video is being made, 28 of them have ratified the treaties in their parliaments. Only Hungary and Turkey haven't done this yet. So, about Turkey. There are a few things about the current situation in the country which you have to know to understand what's happening. 1. The presidential election is scheduled to take place on May 14th, 2023. 2. The current president, Mr. Erdogan, is not necessarily going to win. And 3. He has quite a lot of power in Turkey. All this means that it would be just strange if he didn't use this power to secure the third term. On top of that, Turkey wants to buy some American F-16 jets after getting their initial 2 purchases blocked because they ordered a Russian S-400 air defense system. However, these 2 reasons blend together very well, as the acquisition of F-16s would be a considerable diplomatic win for Erdogan. So the question of why Turkey hasn't accepted Finland's and Sweden's NATO ascension is now more about how Erdogan uses Finland and Sweden to win in this upcoming election. The answer to this question has a lot to do with how the opposition is structured. Erdogan's main rival in the election is a coalition of 6 parties with pretty various views. Despite being rather diverse, it agrees on supporting the ideas of strengthening the parliamentary system, the full guarantee of rule of law, separation of powers and human rights, and overall, moving in the direction of a more liberal democracy. This is largely why the coalition has gained as much popularity as it did. The other main reason is this man, Ekrem İmamoğlu. In 2019, he was elected as the mayor of Istanbul. He narrowly won the election by a margin of less than 14,000 votes, which is really nothing in a city of 15 million people. It would be an understatement to say that İmamoğlu took Istanbul by storm. Then, the election was annulled. But in the next one, İmamoğlu won again, now with a margin of over 800,000 votes. Shortly after, because of how quickly he gained popularity, he was called a possible candidate from the coalition for the 2023 presidential elections. Then, İmamoğlu was noticed by Erdogan. Noticed in a bad way. In January of 2022, İmamoğlu was put on trial for insulting electoral officials, and effectively banned him from competing in the upcoming elections. He called them fools for overturning the first Istanbul mayoral elections in 2019, which is apparently against Turkish law, but now he's appealing the conviction. No matter the results, İmamoğlu will not be able to participate in the 2023 elections. It's not the first time Turkish opposition leaders were thrown out of politics like this. The head of İmamoğlu's party in Istanbul, as well as the leader of the second biggest opposition party in Turkey, were also subject to this kind of prosecution. So we know for sure that Erdogan will take every opportunity to turn the elections in his favor. But what does this have to do with Finland and Sweden? Well, as you might already see, the biggest opposition coalition is generally centrist as opposed to Erdogan's right-leaning alliance. The third coalition, which is generally considered an underdog, is firmly left-wing. So that leaves Erdogan being the only major candidate on the right. So, how about broadening the spectrum of voters and appealing to the far right as well? Basically, Erdogan is doing just that, while capitalizing off of national security threats by oppressing the Kurdish minority, which is not seen as a problem by the opposition. We won't get into the details of why, because there might be enough information there for an entire another video, but the main takeaway is that Finland and Sweden have contributed to the American-led intervention in Syria, supporting the Kurdish groups, with Sweden even supplying them with light anti-tank weapons. That did not go over well with Turkey, which has a goal of establishing a 30-kilometer buffer zone in the north of Syria. It would serve as a place where a considerable portion of Kurds could be resettled. This is not a first, because Turkey already controls a chunk of this zone after a 2019 invasion. This intention can also explain why reversing the F-16 ban would be a diplomatic win to Erdogan. But the Americans are not the only ones to have blocked arms exports to Turkey. Both Sweden and Finland have also stopped supplying weapons. They did it not because of the S-400 air defense system, but in response to the Turkish offensive in 2019, exactly the one mentioned before. So what did Erdogan initially want from Sweden and Finland? First, lift the arms embargo. Second, break any ties with Kurdish forces in Syria. And third, extradite a list of people that are allegedly connected with PKK, a Kurdish group that is recognized as a terrorist organization by both Turkey and the EU. To settle these disagreements, the countries signed a trilateral agreement. And as a result, the first two demands were actually no problem at all. But the third one put Sweden and Finland in a stalemate. It's not rare for Erdogan to erase opponents from politics, so, quite expectedly, he put some people on the list for rather political reasons. Some of the cases have been blocked in court because of the following legal issues. An independent court has to review the cases, so politicians do not really have any power here. Citizens of neither Finland nor Sweden can be extradited. Yes, Erdogan really wants a couple of Finnish and Swedish citizens to be sent to Turkey. Politically incentivized extradition requests simply can't be fulfilled. And lastly, the alleged offenses must be also seen as crimes in Finland or Sweden. So you can't just extradite someone for insulting the Turkish president, even if that is technically illegal in Turkey. Among the so-called terrorists, there are a few blatantly political cases. There's a journalist who was given a suspended jail term for a tweet that said Erdogan's late mother would be ashamed of him. Also, there's a teacher who fled Turkey some 20 years ago, and now couldn't possibly have any ties with the PKK. It really looks like Erdogan just filled the list with people not connected to any terrorism just to make it look more impressive. Anyway, it looks like some progress has been made on this matter, and on the 29th of January, Erdogan said he might approve Finland's application. The Kurdish diaspora is a lot smaller in Finland, so Anakara's dispute with this country is less severe than the one with Sweden. The Finnish foreign minister, however, insisted on waiting to join the alliance together with Sweden. But the wait might get longer than anticipated. On the 21st of January, the Kurdish Democratic Society Center organized an anti-Islamic demonstration against Erdogan and joining NATO. The protest included jumping over a banner portraying the Turkish president, a puppet of Erdogan hanging by his feet, and a burnt copy of the Quran. This is going to be important later in the video. The protests were immediately condemned by Swedish officials, and its foreign minister said that an act of sabotage with respect to the ratification of Sweden's NATO membership. And, well, that's exactly what it was, considering that the Quran was burnt by a far-right pro-Russian extremist, and the demonstration overall was funded by a journalist with Kremlin ties. Turkish officials' reaction to this was rather strong, with Erdogan even saying that Sweden cannot join NATO as long as burning copies of the Quran is allowed, and quite interestingly, adding an additional 130 people to the extradition list. Sweden obviously will not change its laws just to fulfill this specific request, so the three countries agreed to take a timeout regarding NATO talks. However, the recent news tells us that the Swedish government is not going to helplessly watch people ruin the country's intention to join the alliance. On the 8th of February, Swedish police refused to permit a rally that would have included a burning of the Quran. It wasn't the same group of protesters as before, but still, I mean, what are they even hoping for? Did these people really think that burning a Quran twice a month was a good strategy to keep Sweden from joining NATO? Anyway, while this is a rare move by the police, it's definitely the right thing to do, especially considering just how much hostility the entire nation of Sweden received from Muslims because of a small group of Russian-funded extremists. Now back to Turkey. You might have some concerns of whether Erdogan is doing all of this to turn the situation in Russia's favor. In Ukraine, the local joke is that the morning of the average Ukrainian goes like this: wake up, eat your breakfast, brush your teeth, then read the news and check whose side Erdogan took today. For real though, if that were really the case, he would just focus a lot more on targeting Finland with the dilemmas that Sweden is facing right now. He's just doing that to win the upcoming election. There's not really much more to it than that. But what should we expect after the election? Will the winner allow Sweden and Finland to join NATO right away, or will we have to wait even longer? Well, the answer depends on who wins, because if it's the opposition, then it would definitely speed up the process. The opposing alliance does not have a strong anti-Kurdish stance, unlike the currently ruling coalition. It's also a lot more pro-European and pro-NATO. As for Erdogan, he could well approve of both Finland and Sweden joining the North Atlantic Alliance because of growing pressure from other European countries. Though he might have to wait a month or two to pretend that he didn't just use this whole situation to improve his approval ratings. And finally, this is Hungary. This is Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary. This is how many seats his party has in the country's parliament. And this is what he said after winning the election for the fourth consecutive time in May of 2022. You might see what the problem is already, but let's get into the details. Hungary is a part of both the EU and NATO, yet the policies and rhetoric of its government are not quite what you'd expect from one. Let's take a familiar example: the demonstration in Stockholm where a far-right pro-Russian guy burnt a Quran. How did the other alliance members react to this? Interestingly enough, no official statements on these events came from Albania, which is the only Muslim-majority country in NATO, apart from Turkey. Norway didn't permit a similar demonstration shortly after, due to a warning from the Turkish Foreign Ministry. Finland assured that it would not allow acts such as this as well, referring to the Finnish law where violating religious peace is a punishable offense. A German foreign ministry spokesperson said, "It was disrespectful and highly inappropriate, and we also doubt that this action represents the view of the majority of Swedish society." A US State Department spokesman said, "Something can be lawful but awful. What we've seen in the context of Sweden falls into that category," adding that the burning was the work of a provocateur who may have deliberately sought to put distance between two close partners of ours, Turkey and Sweden. He said it was repugnant, disgusting, and vile. But apparently, it was not enough for one of the Turkish media outlets, which went as far as contradicting itself in the title. US says Quran burning in Sweden disrespectful, but falls short of condemning it. When Russians burn copies of the Ukrainian constitution, Ukrainians just laugh and think of it as the terminal stage of coping. When someone burns the Bible, Christians don't care as much as to start worldwide protests. Still, given that the Quran is literally the centerpiece of the culture and society of Islam, it's very easy to understand how some Muslims can even mix up far-right extremists with regular Swedes, who certainly didn't ask for these Quran-burning demonstrations. However, there was one country that stood out from the rest. And you guessed it, it was Hungary. Hungary's foreign minister said, "If a country wants to join NATO and is endeavoring to win over Turkish support, then perhaps it should behave a little more carefully." Hungary stood out as the only country to shift the blame from extremists to the entire government. And it's not a coincidence. Turkey is one of Hungary's best political partners. In fact, Viktor Orban's first post-election visit in 2022 was to Erdogan. The country's officials also did not want to condemn Turkey's military operation in Syria in 2019. As well as that, Hungary has uncommonly good relations with Russia. Its dependence on Russian oil is one of, if not, the highest in Europe. In 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Orban refused to sanction Russia, which continued in 2022, when he strongly opposed energy sanctions and hesitated to let Sweden and Finland in NATO. Now, it's quite easy to see why Hungary is sometimes called the Trojan horse in the EU and NATO. But what are the causes of these unconventional policies? Turns out, there's enough information for yet an entirely another video, so here's the short answer. First, Viktor Orban is a very influential figure. So in some cases, his political decisions are based on his own views. And these views are not what you'd expect from a European prime minister. Here's a couple of his quotes. "We do not want to become peoples of mixed race. Ukraine is a land of nobody. Hope for peace is named Donald Trump." And so on and so on. On top of that, there's the Eastern opening policy, which Orban started all the way back in 2010. It was supposed to boost the economy for Hungary by attracting investors from Asian countries. But in reality, it only tied the country to Chinese and Russian political interests. It is also the primary reason why Turkey and Hungary are close allies. A pretty reasonable question might arise at this point. Why wouldn't Hungary just leave the EU and NATO if it doesn't like the European policies this much? There really are talks about a possible hard exit, but it's not likely that we'll see it anytime soon. The official reasoning provided by Orban is that Hungary is severely dependent on trade in the EU. Well, Eastern opening is a failure, so he's right about this one. But apart from just trade, there's also direct funding from the EU budget. Hungary is the second biggest beneficiary of the EU, only behind Poland, which receives roughly half as much funding per capita. Polling shows that Hungarians think this funding is the best part about being an EU member. So it's important that even a decade of anti-European Orban propaganda is not enough to convince the people of quitting the Union. Naturally, when this funding stops, it's a big deal for Hungary. When the funding was blocked for the first time in April of 2022 due to the increasingly authoritarian policy of Orban's party, Hungary tried to show its power by blocking sanctions against Russia and weapons exports to Ukraine, and not accepting Sweden and Finland into NATO. The intent was to get the funding back without meeting the demands of the EU regarding rule of law, prevention of corruption, and other suggested reforms that would reverse some of Orban's questionable decisions. It seems that Hungary did have a partial success here. In December of last year, a deal was agreed upon. Previously, 7.5 billion euros in payouts were frozen. Now that number has been lowered to 6.3 billion euros. In exchange, Hungary approved an 18 billion euro aid package to Ukraine. To get the rest of the money, it would have to complete 27 anti-corruption and judicial independence reforms. But most importantly, to the topic of this video, the last time Hungary's officials mentioned Sweden and Finland's NATO application was in late January of this year, when its foreign minister reacted to the notorious Koran burning incident. Despite taking quite a strong position there, he mentioned that Hungary still has a clear standpoint on admitting the two new members into the alliance. Earlier, in late November 2022, Orbán stated that he would accept Sweden and Finland's NATO applications at the legislators' first session in 2023, which was planned for mid-February. This is Asia. The continent has a big problem on its hands. Water security is emerging as an increasingly vital issue for the region. This is with good reason, given that Asia is currently facing a major water crisis. And by major, I mean major.
A record-breaking drought, the longest and most severe drought in recent history.
Millions in Syria and Iraq are facing water shortages.
Activists warn that the situation is likely to worsen due to a lack of water resource management.
India, China, Nepal, Bangladesh and Pakistan alone account for nearly half the world's total groundwater use,
sparking the region's worst water crisis in years.
The water challenges plaguing the region are so severe and so intense that many believe that lack of water, yes, water, if unsolved, will lead to the collapse of Asia as a region. Such sentiments make this headline on the United Nations Asian website ring that much deeper. Okay, no more brooding. Let's get to the facts. What is the Asian water crisis, and what's causing it? Naturally, we'll also explore the potential ways this crisis can be resolved, if at all, and the ramifications that it holds. This is going to be an interesting and thorough analysis, so hang on tight. Also, a quick reminder to hit that like button. My recent videos have been getting restricted by YouTube. I assume they are also heavily reported by CCP's bot army, so your support really helps me out tremendously in terms of the algorithm. To begin with, the Asian water crisis is exactly what it sounds like: a shortage of water in the Asian region. Asian countries like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, and Nepal are in positions where the lack of water is posing a real risk to their economies. Right about now, I can hear some of you groaning in disagreement. I bet you're thinking, but Asia has some of the biggest rivers and water bodies. There's no way they can be lacking water. Well, you're right, but then you're also wrong. Confusing? Let me explain. In as much as bodies of water may exist, not all of that water is usable by humans. I'm pretty sure you've heard of sailors dying of thirst whilst out at sea. The seawater is there, but it's not usable. Humans need fresh, clean water. And therein lies the problem. Much like the limited supply of fresh water that sailors can have on a ship, the world's freshwater supply is limited too. You can run out of fresh water, as is the case in many countries right now. You know the vast bodies of water, the seas and oceans that you automatically think of when the word water comes to mind? Well, those cover about 97.5% of the world's water. And well, they're unusable for most things. That leaves the Earth with about 2.5% of the world's water to share. But hey, there's more to that story. Of the 2.5% fresh water, roughly 99% is either trapped in glaciers and ice caps, held as soil moisture, or located in water tables too deep to access. Where does that leave us? Well, with only about 1% of the world's total freshwater supply, a supply that is meant to be consumed by humans and animals. You see, I say all this to highlight just how little fresh water actually exists. And in a minute, you'll see how this ties in with Asia. Now, when looking at fresh water and its global consumption, we need to first explore two concepts: water availability and water access. Defining these terms will show us where Asia is struggling. Okay, so water availability refers to the physical presence of adequate water supplies. It's quite literal, you don't need to fry your brains here. Water access, on the other hand, refers to the ability of people within a particular country or region to actually receive or gain access to clean, fresh water. Again, water access is quite literal. These two concepts are the crucial pillars to which we will examine the water crisis in Asia. You see, water availability may be more dependent on physical or environmental factors. Here, we're talking about things like the geography of a particular country or something like climate change. With water access, it's different. Access may be more dependent on social or political factors. Here I'm referring to how much of a country's agricultural sector is dependent on irrigation, or how effective a country's municipal water supply is. So when we ask the question, are we facing a water crisis? We should actually be framing the question to reflect the problem of availability versus the problem of access. Is the problem water availability in the region, or is it water access? Is Asia simply not receiving enough rainfall? Or is fresh water simply not accessible due to certain practices? Answering these two pillars will help us identify the challenges and ponder the ways that the Asian water crisis can be rectified, or at least bettered. So let's go deep and analyze the first pillar, the availability of water. When you look at Asia as a whole, you'll find that water shortages have become major factors in the economic and social stability of various countries. No two countries better exemplify this concept than China and India. Though China is blessed with numerous freshwater resources, the challenge they face lies in the distribution of these water resources. To put it simply, they are distributed very unevenly, and this results in several regions facing water challenges, whilst other regions don't share the same problems, all within the same country. China's struggles are especially severe. When it comes to China's urban areas, the water problem is especially magnified. How, you ask? Well, of the country's 640 major cities, more than 300 face water shortages. These are urban cities facing water shortages. I don't need to tell you the consequences that this can have on health and societal practices. As for the regions and cities that do currently have water, well, that might not be the case for much longer. This is because clean water is becoming increasingly scarce due to an increase in domestic and industrial pollutants. Pollutants, you may ask? Yes, China is notorious for this. Thousands of tons of pollutants from agricultural, industrial, and municipal sources are dumped into the nation's rivers, lakes, and reservoirs annually. This is not exclusive to China alone, as it's done in several Asian countries, something that is definitely contributing to the water crisis. Using China as a case study for the economical ramifications of this water scarcity will produce figures that will just blow your mind. Due to the water shortages in Chinese cities, it's estimated that $11.2 billion is lost in industrial output each year. That's no small figure. When you factor in the cost to human health of water pollution, those figures combined come to over $15 billion per year. Keyword being per year. As the problem persists, you can only expect these figures to rise even higher. Remember, almost every Asian country is in this position. The figure may change, but the problem persists. In all truthfulness, water scarcity is likely to worsen in Asia in the years ahead. This will have a huge negative impact on food security, as Asian agriculture is already heavily reliant on irrigation, with much of the anticipated increase in food production likely to be dependent on even higher levels of irrigation and irrigation efficiency. I'll dive more in depth into this later. For now, let's look at the second pillar, water access. Now that we've talked about availability, it's time to look at the second pillar, water access. We often generalize to say that whenever there's a water shortage, it's due to the unavailability of water. But many experts state that when people do not have safe drinking water, it's often an issue of access. Sandra Postel, the founding director of the Global Water Policy Project, has stated before, it's a problem of inadequate government investment, of political will, of making it a priority to meet the basic water needs of the poor. It's a solvable problem if we just decide to do it. For the most part, the resources or structures surrounding access to safe, fresh water largely depend on the level of development of that particular country. When it comes to the level of governance and systems that you will find within Asia, industrialized countries like Japan, Singapore, and Taiwan have fewer problems with providing their populations with access to safe, fresh water. In fact, you seldom hear of these countries whenever the Asian water crisis is mentioned. On the other hand, we have countries like China and India with poor systems that result in severe water struggles. The irony is that both of these countries are military superpowers. All we can say when discussing this pillar of water access is that Asian nations need to do better regarding the way their systems work and the roles of the governments in providing a platform that can enable clean, fresh water for everyone. Now that we've had an in-depth look into both the availability and accessibility of water in Asia, the question becomes, what exactly is it that affects these two pillars? What is happening in Asia is highlighting the availability and accessibility of water more profoundly than in other continents. What are the factors that are influencing the water security issue? Let's get into them. When we're talking about water security as a whole, many factors influence the availability of water and access to it. We need to look at some of these key factors in depth so that we can help to identify the problem areas that are plaguing Asia as a continent. Is it just environmental factors, and can we all do something about it? Or is it the social and political factors, and they can be rectified through administrative and policy changes? Let's get into it and browse the factors behind water security and, most importantly, how they affect economic matters and food security in the Asian region. Obviously, the first thing that gets affected when water supplies become a problem is food security. In fact, in a region where the population is densely populated, like Asia, food is always a priority. Due to the water crisis in the region, several experts are warning that food production will likely be seriously constrained by freshwater shortages in the next century. When you think about the demand for food and the stress that it provides on agriculture and its growth, you will realize that as time moves on, agricultural activities will no doubt suffer. How can you grow food if there's barely sufficient irrigation water? As the populations of Asia continue to rise, so too does the pressure for agricultural products to increase in response to the market's needs. This becomes quite hard as well. Agriculture is extremely dependent on an adequate fresh water supply. So what we have here is a case of experts predicting that the Asian water crisis will worsen in the coming years. Simultaneously, they're saying that the demand for food will increase. So you can see the discrepancy here, right? And it's not that agriculture will be a victim of the water crisis. It's kind of also the reason that the water crisis exists. Let me explain that. The Green Revolution resulted in increased crop yields, but achieved these yields largely through extensive irrigation and with increased reliance on fresh water. Almost 70% of the world's freshwater supply is devoted to agriculture and thus is unavailable for other uses. In Asia, this reliance is even more significant because an estimated 35 to 40% of the region's cultivated land is irrigated, and this area produces over 60% of Asia's total agricultural output. What this shows us is that in Asia, the growing demand for food is a significant factor determining the supply of available fresh water. Once again, let's look at China as a case study. I mean, with all the history we've covered on China, I feel like you would relate better to it. Okay, so it is commonly accepted that with growing population demands, food production will need to be increased dramatically. And given the fact that China is trying to grow its population, well, the demand for agriculture is expected to intensify. To meet the anticipated demand, 70% of the additional food supply in China during the next 25 to 30 years is expected to come from irrigated lands. The problem, however, is that irrigation is expensive, mainly because, well, it's not the most efficient of methods. About half of the water that is used for irrigation is lost to seepage and evaporation. Given that Asian countries like China, Indonesia, India, Korea, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka have above 30% of their total cropland under irrigation, well, this becomes a big problem. This is land that will require fresh water to sustain it, however inefficiently. All this makes the available water for direct human use significantly less. It is a ticking time bomb. To add to the challenge of it all, irrigation can be a powerful tool for expanding crop yields, but it can also be extremely dangerous when mismanaged. What I mean by this is that mismanaging water resources can result in the erosion, waterlogging, and salinization of the soil, which in turn makes the soil less able to produce crops. Poorly managed irrigation can also result in water pollution and waterborne diseases. It can all go left pretty quickly. Let's move on to the next factor that influences water security in the region. Aside from agriculture, another big factor that is influencing the state of water security in Asia is the degree of industrialization in the region. What I mean is that industries in general account for roughly 25% of the world's water use. When we factor in industrial countries such as China, the manufacturing hub of the world, that figure scales as high as 50 to 80%. This is why when the drought started in China, factories closed at an alarming rate. And when factories close, I don't have to tell you what this means for the economic output of a nation. However, industrial activity is also a big factor in causing water security concerns, as most industrial activity requires massive amounts of fresh water. This is for use in activities such as boiling, cleaning, air conditioning, cooling, processing, transportation, and energy production. As Asian countries like China maintain and grow their industries, they must use ever greater quantities of water, making the already meager water resources even more strained. In industrialization, however, unlike in agriculture, there is a sliver of hope. Much of the water can be recycled, as very little of it is consumed. In developed industrial countries like China, the primary impetus for water recycling is compliance with pollution laws. Since it is often more economical to comply with pollution laws by recycling water, less is wasted. Unfortunately, some of these practices are not adhered to in poorer Asian countries because the governments don't provide industries with incentives to adopt more efficient water use practices. Consequently, although the amount of water being used for industrial purposes is decreasing in the developed world, it's actually increasing in poorer countries. This further strains freshwater resources in countries already facing rapid urbanization. That is a big part of Asia's problem right now. Remember when we talked about water availability earlier and how environmental factors come into play? Yes? All right, good. Then you've been listening. Well, environmental factors can influence water security for a particular region, as is the case with Asia. Many countries throughout the world routinely dump human and industrial waste into their rivers and lakes. In developing countries, roughly 90 to 95% of all domestic sewage and 75% of all industrial waste are discharged into surface waters without any treatment. Asia, in particular, is insanely notorious for its water pollution, and that is a major factor behind the dwindling availability of its fresh water. Take South Korea, for example. Did you know that more than 300 factories along the Nakhtong River illegally discharge toxic waste directly into the river? Or maybe take China, our go-to case study. Nearly 3/4 of the nation's rivers are so badly polluted that they no longer support fish life. And if you thought water pollution was bad in China, wait till you take a look at India. Millions actually die annually because of water pollution in the nation. It's not surprising given that all of India's 14 major rivers are polluted, primarily because they transport 50 million cubic meters of untreated sewage into India's coastal waters every year. New Delhi alone is responsible for dumping more than 200 million liters of raw sewage and 20 million liters of industrial waste into the Yamuna River as it passes through the city on its way to the Ganges. Imagine that. The same trend can be seen in many Southeast Asian countries. In Malaysia and Thailand, pollutants in those nations' rivers, such as pathogens, heavy metals, and various poisons from industry and agriculture, regularly exceed government standards by 30 to 100 times. I mean, it's no wonder why we have an Asian water crisis. But those are not the only environmental factors at play. When it comes to water security in Asia, global warming and climate change also play huge factors. For example, as the most recent events in China and parts of Asia have shown, changing weather patterns could result in droughts in areas accustomed to plentiful rainfall and vice versa. These devastating droughts are ravaging South Asia just about every year. The countries most affected include Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. All of them are subject to the most damaging outcomes of droughts, like agricultural land destruction, an increasingly dehydrated population with little access to clean water, and growing social distress. Recently, China had a heat wave followed by a drought that also made water security quite the topic. I made a video about it on this channel, so feel free to click the link in the description below to have a look at it. Speaking of environmental factors, land degradation is another factor to consider when it comes to the availability of water. As countries experience greater urbanization and deforestation, less land is available in the nation to absorb and hold water. Degraded land usually has reduced vegetative cover, and the soil is less able to hold water. This results in rainfall causing flash runoff, leading to reduced seepage. Looking at our Asian countries, India is the perfect case study. Land degradation in the nation has resulted in reduced aquifer recharge, even in areas that receive large amounts of annual rainfall. And just so we're all on the same page, aquifer recharge and aquifer storage are man-made processes that convey water underground. This process replenishes groundwater stored in aquifers for beneficial purposes. However, land degradation is limiting their effectiveness in India. China is not that much better either. The water tables in Beijing, beneath the city, are dropping by a rate of roughly 1 to 2 meters a year. To add to this, over 30% of all the city's wells have already been reported to have dried up. I know we've talked about a few things under environmental factors, but there's still one more thing to discuss. It's closely linked to land degradation, and that is deforestation. Deforestation is rife in Asia, with the continent losing its forest cover to shrinking by 1% a year. According to Earth.org, Southeast Asia has lost more than half of its original forest cover, causing what some experts to argue to be one of the most severe biodiversity loss crises. These experts warn over 40% of the region's biodiversity will be extinct or completely disappear by 2100, should current deforestation activity continue. And as much as 2100 sounds far, time moves pretty quickly. I mean, it's just a few decades from now. Looking at another Asian nation, the forests of Indonesia are shrinking at a rate of between 600,000 and 1.3 million hectares per year. This is a consequence of illegal logging and the conversion of forests into large-scale commercial agricultural and timber plantations. Let's look at Cambodia next. In the late 1960s, forests covered over 70% of the country, but now only about half are still in existence. They aren't the only Asian countries to exhibit this either. Similarly, trends can be seen in Thailand, where between 1961 and 1988, forest cover shrank from 55% of the country's land area to 28%. So yes, understand that deforestation is a major factor in water security. The fact is, if trees are removed, it can create a cycle of flooding and drought that results in extreme soil erosion and, in most extreme cases, desertification. It is impossible, or maybe rather fruitless, to look at all the factors influencing water security and not talk about humans and demographics. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world's population was roughly 1.6 billion people. But at the present date, the global population is 8 billion. Asia's population alone is 4.7 billion. That is a lot of mouths to feed. This, no doubt, adds to the challenge for water security in the region. Now that we've covered the factors that are influencing the water crisis, we need to understand that there are geopolitical ramifications that come as a result of shortages of water. Let's take a look at that in depth. With the scarcity of water in the region, there is bound to be some sort of conflict in the region, seeing as several Asian countries share the same water sources. Most disputes between nations over fresh water resources are not likely to spark violent conflict. However, the tensions can have long-lasting and destabilizing effects on regional and international security. Let's take a look at two such cases to highlight this better. For several years, India and Bangladesh have exchanged sharp accusations over shared river resources. In 1993, tensions between India and Bangladesh boiled over when the dry season flow of the Ganges River reached severely low levels and resulted in crop losses in Bangladesh. Later, in October of 1995, the Bangladesh Prime Minister delivered an address to the United Nations in which she called India's diversion of river water near the border a gross violation of human rights and justice. India's establishment of the Farakka barrage on the Ganges River near the border with Bangladesh has also sparked conflict and disagreement between the two nations. India's purpose in building the barrage was to divert water from the Calcutta port, but Bangladesh contends that such diversion has resulted in falling water tables and greater water salinity downstream for Bangladesh. Naturally, this situation has caused severe tensions and fractures in international relations between the nations. And much like any other international conflict, each country has a different perspective on the matter, and this makes agreements difficult. But in 1996, the Treaty on the Sharing of Waters of the Ganga was signed between the two nations as a middle ground. Since the treaty was signed, there has been relative peace between the two, but Bangladesh still voices concerns. And what we all fear when it comes to international relations is that, though it may start as a water issue, it can quickly evolve into something else. This is just one case, but there are constant conflicts throughout the region that happen because of water concerns. India and China have had several issues when it comes to the sharing of water resources. These have further fueled the tension between the two nations. Take a look at this video that I made a few weeks back detailing the struggles between these two nations. If the water crisis in the Asian region persists, matters could quickly devolve into something else. So, at the end of the day, what do we have? We have a region that has over 4.7 billion people that are struggling to keep up with water demands. Struggling is a generous word, I guess. Asia is in a crisis that is influenced by several factors that we've discussed. Whether the leaders of the region address these issues seriously, well, it's yet to be seen, but one thing is for sure. Lives and livelihoods are at stake. Failure to curb this crisis is definitely not an option.